First things first, before I kick off the show, I'd like to thank my latest patron, Evan, who is my new Night Spear. Second, my apologies for the wonky audio. This episode is the product of several tech upgrades, and because my understanding of audio editing amounts to sounds like shit, adjust until it doesn't sound like shit, and lock in the settings, having my old laptop crap out means I've had to start my trial by fire and error all over with the latest edition of Audacity, and it may take a few tries before I sound better. Hopefully, I'll be helped by my new mic, at least once I figure out its generous learning curve. I swapped out the condenser mic for a dynamic one in the hopes I won't have to edit out assholes accelerating up the hill or stomping around upstairs. Which brings me back to my patrons, because it is thanks to all of you that making these two costly purchases was not irresponsible. In the spirit of that, I'd like to shout you out again, so thanks to, in no particular order, Holly, DT, Daniel, Rob, DK Moon, Amy, Jordo, Kev, Chris, Madi, Kat, Koala, and, of course, Evan. You are all amazing. Because of you, I didn't have to either A, be irresponsible, or B, act like a grown-up and choose between getting new equipment or going to WatCon, which will be this week, July 14th through the 16th in Columbus, Ohio. If you'll be there, come get a sticker or magnet and tell me what you love about the Wheel of Time. I'll be on a couple of different panels talking about Season 1 of the show and also building an outrigger, which sounds like it's going to be especially fun, so I hope to see you there. The stone won't fall until the podcast of the dragon comes to your device. Hey everybody, my name is Morgan. Research takes effort, so maybe instead of facts, I could do suppositions. Welcome to episode 43 of Podcast of the Dragon. Sad boy Randall Thor goes through a lot in the fires of heaven, not the least of which is having an even sadder boy keep showing up in his head. In this episode, we'll follow the dragon through his Book 5 journey and watch as he walks the line of madness. The Fires of Heaven is a book where Robert Jordan devotes a full 60% of the word count to two characters. If you've ever wondered where I get my information about point of view percentages and word count, the What Wiki has a lovely page devoted to statistical analysis made by nerds who nerd much harder than I do, and it's thanks to them that I can pass on that minutia to you. It's thanks to them that I know Nynaeve and Rand each get a 30% slice of the word pie that is this book, with Egwene such a distant third that RJ could not make it more plain that Nynaeve and Rand are what this book is about. Nynaeve and Rand are at the heart of this story. This book is about them overcoming individual troubles, experiencing triumphs and losses, and suffering disasters from their screw-ups. RJ even brings them together to work as a team in the final boss battle, each saving the other from what would have been a fatal mistake. And so, having looked at Nynaeve's characterization within her storyline in the Fires of Heaven, it's now time to take a closer look at the dragon. Rand in this book has become truly kingly, comfortable in his authority and full of a precarious confidence, a self-assuredness that will last only until he makes a really serious mistake, and which weakens as he's starting to go crazy. RJ shows Rand throughout Book 5 displaying a number of the traits that exemplify leadership, from a determination not to have favorites to an expectation of obedience, from unflinchingly making hard choices to being willing to use people. And as he grows more practiced and settled in his leadership, perhaps not so coincidentally, his mental health begins to degrade again, and we start getting regular glimpses of Lews Therin Telamon. To explore Rand's characterization in the Fires of Heaven, I feel like rather than focusing on individual themes and examining them in turn, it's best just to follow his story. Jordan lays it out in 5 different sections in this book, starting with chapters 2 through 7, which take place over approximately half a day in Roydian. RJ opens chapter 2 with Rand framed in a window, bathed in late afternoon sunlight, with the dragons on his arms just a glitter. We get a recappy mention that they mark him as he who comes with the dawn and the dragon reborn, and it says, they were names he would have avoided if he could, but that time was long past, if it had ever existed, and he no longer thought of it. Or if he did, on rare occasion, it was with the faint regret of a man recalling a foolish dream of his boyhood, as if he were not close enough to boyhood to remember every minute. Instead, he tried to think only of what he had to do. Fate and duty held him on the path like a rider's reins, but he had often been called stubborn. The end of the road must be reached, but if it could be attained by a different way, maybe it need not be the end. Small chance. No chance, almost certainly. The prophecies demanded his blood. So RJ is leading into this change in tone for Rand's character. This guy here is much more steady than the one who closed out Book 4. This is someone comfortable in the skin of the dragon, someone who is no longer feeling sorry for himself, and while he would like a better outcome than this fate that is prescribed, and he won't resign himself to hopelessness, he's realistic about what prophecy calls for, and he's not dreaming of running. In this scene here, Rand is taking 5 from a meeting with the clan chiefs, and he's watching the plaza where Moraine is directing the dark friend peddler Hadnan Kadir as he and his men load his wagons with the objects of the power that are scattered everywhere. And RJ immediately focuses on the red stone doorway by having one of Kadir's men fall partway through, giving a lovely little preview of the first of the 2 climaxes that we get in the final section of this book. Rand then returns to the 6 chiefs, and they discuss how to get the other clans to join him. And Rourke tells him, just wait, Derek will bring the rain. And Rand asks about the Miagoma, and Aram tells him that their chief Timolan is impulsive, and Jerem adds that Timolan will be jealous because at one time he wanted to unite the clans, but Rourke's like, nah, he'll come, and Janwin will bring the Shianda, to which Han says once they get over he who comes with the dawn being a wetlander. And Bruin adds, same for the Darine and the Kadara, but Mandalane and Endirion have more important things to deal with, i.e., your revelations are shredding their clans right now, and they'll want to see the dragons on your arms. And then Rand asks, what about the Shido? And it says, is there any hope that Couladin will meet with me? Rand knew there was not. He had stopped sending requests for a meeting once he learned Couladin was having the messenger skinned alive, but it was a way to start the others talking. Hans snorted. The only word we have had from him is that he means to flay you when next he sees you. Does that sound as if he will talk? Can I break the Shido away from him? They follow him, Rourke said. He is not a chief at all, but they believe he is. Couladin had never entered those glass columns. He might even still believe, as he claimed, that everything Rand had said was a lie. He says that he is the Kara Karn, and they believe that as well. The Shido maidens who came for their society, and that because Farda Raismai carried your honor. None else will. We send scouts to watch them, Bruin said, and the Shido kill them when they can. Couladin builds the makings of half a dozen feuds, but so far he shows no sign of attacking us here. I've heard that he claims we have defiled Roydian, and that attacking us here would only deepen the desecration. Aram grunted and shifted on his cushion. He means there are enough spears here to kill every Shido twice over and to spare. He popped a piece of white cheese into his mouth, growling around it. The Shido were ever cowards and thieves. Rand is trying to be the Kara Karn to all, and take responsibility for the choice that he made to reveal the truth of the Aiel's origin. Because he has a strong desire to not leave any more fuckery in his wake than he can absolutely help. He got off to a bad start with them. And while this is not totally his fault, not even close, he'll still go more than halfway to cross these bridges and reach out to people and try to unfuck this. Rand's meeting with the chiefs ends, partly because it's done, but also because Moraine shows up with Egwene, and RJ shows us through Rand's interactions with Moraine that he's gone from being combative to snidely antagonistic with her, and there's a further shift in power between them. He's arrogant and unnecessarily rude when she tells him that the wagons will soon be ready to go to Tarvalon, and he makes a shitty comment about it, and Moraine is beyond frustrated with him at this point, so she loses her temper and hits him with a stick of air. And he spins around but doesn't know which of them did it because Egwene's got her best Aes Sedai face on, and he is almost positive that it's her because Moraine's not going to hit him with a stick of air. She's Aes Sedai. She's not going to lose her cool, but he's not certain that it's Egwene, and he refuses to be goaded and retaliate if he doesn't know for sure. So he limits his hostilities to words, and it says, "What do you want of me?" His voice sounded flat and cold to his own ears. The power stormed inside him. Egwene had told him that for a woman touching Saidar was an embrace. For a man, always, it was a war without mercy. And don't mention wagons again, little sister. I usually find out what you mean to do long after it is done. The Aes Sedai frowned at him, and no wonder. She was surely not used to being addressed so, not by any man, even the Dragon Reborn. He had no idea himself where little sister had come from. Sometimes of late words seemed to pop into his head. A touch of the madness, perhaps. Some nights he lay awake till the small hours, worrying about that. Inside the void it seemed someone else's worry. That's awkward and uncomfortable. He's had little bitty outbursts before, but never in front of anybody who really mattered. It's such a blatantly weird thing to say, and it sets the tone for Rand's mind not being totally under his own control. Moraine wants Rand to make Asmodean fuck off, but Rand insists she can talk in front of him because he's careless about Asmodean. He figures, well, Asmodean has no choice but to support me, so fuck it, who cares what he hears? And Moraine doesn't fight about it. She just shows Rand one of her seals on the Dark One's prison and shaves a slice off, like, hey presto, they're no longer Quaindiari. 4 guys with hammers could fast-track Tarmin Guyton. And then she wants to discuss plans because she thinks that he doesn't have one. They're having the same argument that they were having in Book 4, and Rand is super sensy about it. It says, I do have a plan. If they wanted to know, let them know, and he would be burned if he changed a word. First, I mean to put an end to the wars and killing, whether I started them or not. If men have to kill, let them kill Trollocs, not each other. In the Aiel War, 4 clans crossed the Dragon Wall and had their way for better than 2 years. They looted and burned Cairhien, defeated every army sent against them. They could have taken Tarvalon if they wanted. The Tower couldn't have stopped them because of your 3 oaths. 4 clans did that. What will happen when I lead 11 across the spine of the world? It would have to be 11. Small hope of bringing in the Shido. By the time the nations even think of uniting, it will be too late. They'll accept my peace or I'll be buried in the canned breed. A discordant plunk rose from the harp, and a tail bent over the instrument, shaking his head. In a moment the soothing sounds came again. And they continue to argue because Moraine thinks that bringing the Aiel back over the Dragon Wall will be a fucking disaster, but he's not interested in what she has to say, and so it ends on a bad note. She mocks him and leaves, and then Egwene rips into him and more or less tells him he's being an asshole, which is fair. He is being an asshole. And in the process of ripping into him, she accidentally let slip to him that Moraine was the one of the 2 of them that thumped him. And then she gets even more upset. And it says, he gaped at her as the tirade went on, with her more furious than at any time since first coming through the bead curtain. Then it hit him, that little near shake of her head that she had not meant to give, letting him know it had been Moraine who struck him with the power. Egwene worked very hard at doing what she was about in proper fashion. Studying with the wise ones, she wore Aiel clothes. She might even be trying to adopt Aiel customs for all he knew. It would be like her. But she worked hard at being a proper Aes Sedai all the time, even if she was only one of the accepted. Aes Sedai usually kept a rein on their tempers, but they never ever gave away anything that they wanted to hide. Ilyena never flashed her temper at me when she was angry with herself. When she gave you the rough side of her tongue, it was because she... His mind froze for an instant. He had never met a woman named Ilyena in his life, but he could summon up a face for the name, dimly. A pretty face, skin like cream, golden hair exactly the shade of Elaine's. This had to be the madness, remembering an imaginary woman. Perhaps one day he would find himself having conversations with people who were not there. So RJ gives us quite a good view in this very first Rand perspective of the progression of his insanity. He's hearing thoughts and having associations, occasional personality overlap, getting Lews Therin's voice and memories. But he's not struggling yet, and so he can think about it in almost a detached fashion. There's no real urgency or sense of strain. It's almost a philosophical problem. In the 7 chapters at Roydian, RJ paints an uncomfortably clear picture of how the lines are beginning to blur between Rand and Lews Therin Telamon. Egwene, who notices that Rand's kind of fucked up when he has the thought about Ilyena and even offers to bring Moraine back, tells him to rest and leaves, which ends chapter 2, and we immediately transition into chapter 3, which focuses on Rand and Asmodean. And we get to see that Rand is still pretty decent and fair-hearted, even with people who don't deserve it. As he's talking to Egwene at the end of the previous chapter, Asmodean floats a goblet of wine to him, noticing that he's not looking his best and seems in need of refreshment. And RJ starts chapter 3 with Rand throwing the wine and then using the power to physically intimidate Asmodean for channeling in front of another person. He's like, I told you don't ever channel when anybody else is around, and basically picks him up and slams him with the one power. And it says, feeling disgusted with himself as much as angry at the man, Rand unraveled the weave and let him drop. Manhandling him was like picking a fight with a boy of 10. He could not see the shield that constricted the other man's access to Sidene. It was female work, but he knew it was there. Moving a goblet was about the extent of Natail's ability now. Luckily, the shield had been hidden from female eyes, too. Natail called the trick inverting. He did not seem able to explain it, though. We get some recap about the dangers of learning to channel without a teacher. Then it says, you were not teaching me very well as may be expected under the circumstances. You can grasp Sidene every time you try now, and tell one flow from another. You can shield yourself, and the power does what you want it to. He stopped playing and frowned, not looking at Rand. Do you think Lanfear really intended me to teach you everything? If she had wanted that, she would have contrived to stay close so she could link us. She wants you to live, Lews Therin, but this time she means to be stronger than you. Don't call me that, Rand snapped, but Asmodean did not seem to hear. If you planned this between you, trapping me, Rand sensed a surge in Asmodean, as if the Forsaken were testing the shield Lanfear had woven around him. Women who could channel saw a glow surrounding another woman who had embraced Saidar and felt her channeling clearly, but he never saw anything around Asmodean and felt little. If you worked it out together, then you let her outfox you on more levels than one. I've told you I am not a very good teacher, especially without a link. You did plan it between you, didn't you? He did look at Rand then, sidelong but still intent. How much do you remember? Of being Lews Therin, I mean. She said you recalled nothing at all, but she could lie to the Dark One himself. This time she spoke the truth. Seating himself on one of the cushions, Rand channeled one of the clan chief's untouched silver goblets to him. Even such a brief touch of Sidene was exhilarating and fouling and hard to release. He did not want to talk about Lews Therin. He was tired of people thinking he was Lews Therin. So Rand, in blatant contradiction of the slips that he's just experienced in front of Moraine and Egwene as Asmodean quietly strummed his harp in the corner and took it all in, tells Asmodean there's no Lews Therin here. The perspective ends with Rand weaving a burning net around the room to contain Asmodean before leaving to walk to the roof of the Maidens, and we switch to Matt's point of view so Jordan can call Rand a liar and make it creepier by showing it through the eyes of someone who knew him from before. Matt is gambling, drinking usquai, and knife-throwing with a bunch of the Aiel warriors. He meets Melindra, and while talking to her, he sees Rand walking through the square, and decides that he's going to go and tell Rand that he's out of there. When Kadir leaves, so will he. And it says, Rand? The other man walked on with his encircling escort. Rand? Rand was not even 10 paces away, but he did not waver. Some of the maidens looked back, but not Rand. Matt felt cold suddenly, and it had nothing to do with the onset of night. He wet his lips and spoke again. Not a shout. Lews Therin. And Rand turned around. Matt almost wished he had not. And then, just to give a little more emphasis, after Rand deals with the Darkhound attack and returns to his room, he checks his hidey hole where he has the access keys for the Chodan Call, and Lanfear turns up, sees that he has the female as well as the male statuette, and is like, "Fuck yeah, you're considering my master plan will destroy everyone and rule forever, mwahaha." And Lews Therin speaks to her, calling her Mierin and telling her that she disgusts him and that she was gone from his heart long before he ever met Ilyena because power is all that she ever wanted. And Rand additionally has a vision or memory of being with Lanfear as Lews Therin while they were both young. So RJ gives us a baseline for Rand's mental state during these 12 plus hours in Rhuidean in this first cluster of chapters before they learn that Couladin is heading for the Dragon Wall. We leave Rand and crew after Chapter 7 and spend 12 chapters in Amadicia, Altara, Lugard, and Caemlyn, where Jordan advances Elaine and Nynaeve's plot and sends them to join the circus, catches us up with Swan and Gareth Bryn, shows Moghedien conscripting the remaining members of the original Black Aja, and in Chapter 19, which is called Memories, Robert Jordan explores the smallest subplot in the book, which is that of Morghese learning about the rebellion in the Two Rivers from Guardsman Lieutenant Talonvor, going to Gabriel about it and having him compel her, telling her, "I took care of it, go take a nap," and her being capable of overcoming it because she sees that he's talking to all of her political enemies. So instead of taking a nap, she goes to Linny, who with Talonvor helps her escape. So the smallest subplot, and yet the one that the climax hinges on. The next section of Rand's story takes place over 6 chapters, going into and coming out of the Jangai Pass as they cross into Cairhien. Chapter 20 is helpfully called Jangai Pass and begins, "Under the looming spine of the world, Rand guided Jaden up the stony slope from the foothills that began the foot of the Jangai Pass. The Dragon Wall pierced the sky, dwarfing all other mountains, its snow-capped peaks defying the baking afternoon sun. The tallest thrust well above clouds that mocked the waste with promises of rain that had never come. Rand could not imagine why a man would want to climb a mountain, but it was said that men who had tried to scale these heights turned back, overcome with fear and unable to breathe. He could well believe that a man might grow too afraid to breathe, attempting to climb so high. Yet though the Cairhien are consumed with the game of houses, Moraine was saying at his shoulder, they will follow you so long as they know that you are strong. Be firm with them, but I would ask you to be fair also, a ruler who gives true justice." He tried to ignore her, as he did the other riders and the creak and rumble of Kadir's wagons, making heavy going further back. The broken gorges and gullies of the waste were behind them, but these rugged rising hills, nearly as barren, were little better for wagons. No one had traveled this path in over 20 years. Moraine talked at him that way from daybreak to sunset whenever he let her. Her lectures could be on small things, details of court behavior, say, in Cairhien or Saldaia or somewhere else, or on large, the political influence of the White Cloaks, or perhaps the effect of trade on rulers' decisions to go to war. It was as if she meant to see him educated as a noble would be or should be before he reached the other side of the mountains. It was surprising how often what she said reflected what anyone back in Emmons Field would have called simple common sense, and also how often it did not. RJ sets the scene a little bit further by having Rand describe the ruins of a city from the breaking, high up on the mountain near one side of the pass, and a giant caduceus carved into the cliff wall on the other side, at the base of which sits the town of Tain. It says, "The blotches on the walls of Tain were bodies, contorted in their final agonies, bloating in the sun and hanging by their necks in a row that seemed to encircle the town. The birds were glossy black ravens and vultures with their heads and necks befouled. Some ravens perched on corpses, gorging, unconcerned with the new arrivals. The sickly sweet stench of corruption hung in the dry air, and the acrid smell of char. Iron-strapped gates stood gaping open on an expanse of ruin, soot-streaked stone houses and collapsed roofs. Nothing moved except the birds. Like Marruoi." He tried to shake the thought away, but in his head he could see that great city after it was retaken, Immense towers blackened and collapsing, the remains of great bonfires at every street crossing where those who had refused to swear to the shadow had been bound and thrown alive to the flames. He knew whose memory it had to be, though he had not discussed it with Moraine. I am Rand al'Thor. Lews Therin Telamon is dead 3,000 years. I am myself. That was one battle he meant to win. If he did have to die at Shale Ghul, he would die as himself. He made himself think of something else. RJ opens this chapter with a very evocative setting. He manages to do some poignant world building with very little text just by having Rand find what he's looking at so striking. Rand is a character that RJ never ceases to be able to convey curiosity and wonder through. The main focus of this chapter is the refugees from Tain, who will stagger out and tell Rand, "Thank the light that you survived in that terrible place. There's like 100 of us. They came over the walls in the night and took people Guy Shane and said to leave the bodies as a message for you." But before we get distracted by all that drama, RJ wants us to note two things. The fact that Lews Therin is this consistent presence now, and the shift in the relationship between Moraine and Rand, which is the subject of its own episode. All I'll say is that this is after the meeting between Egwene and Nynaeve in Tel Riyadh, so Moraine knows Elaida is Amerlin, and she had already stopped trying to keep Rand from following Couladin even before that because he ordered her to. Her reaction to Egwene's news about Elaida is to think that perhaps it won't matter so much that Rand is bringing the Aiel across the Dragon Wall, as Elaida is unlikely to have been fostering diplomatic ties for him to damage. Now Moraine's focus is to drill into him everything that he needs to know about Cairhien and politics, since the path is going to spit them out into Cairhien and there's going to be fuckery from the get-go. Despite Moraine's protests, Rand really had no choice but to follow Couladin. His coming to the Waste was the catalyst that sent the Shido over the Dragon Wall, and even without the Shido, Rand was headed to Cairhien ultimately. He feels tremendous obligation to the Cairhienin. Moraine told him at the end of the Great Hunt that he was the spark for the Civil War. And even if he doesn't feel truly responsible for that shit show in the same way he felt responsible for the chaos that broke out in the West after he proclaimed himself the dragon, he's definitely on the hook for the Terran soldiers he sent north to impose order and distribute grain. They were awfully amped up after hearing that the armies of Tyr were going to march, jumping around and shouting, "Cairhien will fall." So he knows that the Terrans in Cairhien will inevitably be looking to enrich themselves, increase their power, and carve out estates. He always had unfinished business in Cairhien. He was just hoping to return to the wetlands benevolently, coming into Cairhien as the leader of these Terran soldiers on a humanitarian mission to bring food. But thanks to Couladin's bullshit, this is what he gets instead. Rand sends scouts, specifically not maidens, into the pass to make sure Couladin didn't leave any more surprises, and he has everyone camp in the mouth of the pass, and we immediately transition into Chapter 21, The Gift of a Blade. And it's obviously when Aviendha gives him his sword, and generally it focuses on drama and contention between the two of them on the back end of the chapter, but it's structurally one of RJ's people set up camp for the night and disperse chapters, of which he has many in the series. He moves people around and has them interact and gets them into place for their next important action, in this case the Trolloca Darkfriend attack that will happen in the next chapter. And as Rand is walking toward where his tent is being raised, we get this. The sound of music drew him to Asmodean, seated by himself on a granite outcrop with his harp on his knee. The Crimson Banner's staff had been twisted into the rocky soil, and the mule tethered to it. "You see, my Lord Dragon," he said cheerfully, "your bannerman keeps loyally to his duties." His voice and expression changed, and he said, "If you must have this thing, why not let Mat carry it, or Lon, or Moraine, for that matter? She would be glad to carry your banner and clean your boots. Be careful of her. She is a devious woman. When a woman says she will obey you of her own will, it is time to sleep lightly and watch your back. You carry it because you were chosen, Master Jason Natale." Asmodean gave a start and looked around, though everyone else was too far away and too busy to be listening. None but they two would have understood anyway. "What do you know about those ruins up near the snow line? They must come from the Age of Legends." Asmodean did not even glance up the mountain. This world is very changed from the world I went to sleep in. He sounded weary, and he shivered slightly. What I know of what lies where I have learned since waking. The mournful sounds of the March of Death rose from his harp. That could be what is left of the city where I was born, for all I know. Chorel was a port. The sun had maybe an hour before the spine of the world hit it. This close to high mountains, night came early. I am too tired for one of our discussions tonight. That was what they called Asmodean's lessons in public, even when no one was around. Added to practice sessions with Lon or Rourke, those lessons had left him little time for sleep since leaving Roydian. You take to your tent when you're ready, and I will see you in the morning, with the banner. There was no one else to carry the bloody thing. Maybe he could find somebody in Cairien. As he was turning away, Asmodean plucked something discordant and said, "No burning nets woven around my tent tonight? Do you finally begin to trust me?" Rand looked back over his shoulder. "I trust you like a brother, until the day you betray me. You have a parole for what you've done in return for your teaching, and a better bargain than you deserve, but the day you turn against me I will tear it up and bury it with you." Asmodean opened his mouth, but Rand forestalled him. "That is me talking, Natale. Rand al'Thor. Two Rivers folk don't like people who try to stab them in the back." Irritably, he pulled at the Dapple's reins and went on before the other man could say anything. He was not sure whether Asmodean had any inkling that a dead man was trying to take him over, but he should not let himself give the man hints. Asmodean was sure enough already that his was a helpless cause. If he began to think that Rand was not in full control of his own mind, perhaps that he was going mad, the Forsaken would abandon him in a heartbeat, and there was too much Rand had to learn yet. RJ can't give us a lot with Rand and Asmodean, but what he grants us shows a strange relationship between captor and captive, with Asmodean's bleak practicality a little bit too honest for Rand's Two Rivers sensibilities. There's one of my favorite little bits of world building in the previous chapter where Rand sees the high ruins up near the snow line, and I really appreciate the realism of Asmodean's exhaustion with the obscurity of it all, and his impatience as Rand is like, "Do you know what that town is way the fuck up there on that mountain, too high for anybody to ever have even been able to build a town?" Because Rand, you in your internal narrative were just thinking that it's too high to even breathe up there. And Asmodean is just like, how the fuck should he know what it is? Nothing is the same, and doesn't Rand have any idea how hard this is? How emotionally gut-wrenching and terrible all of this has been for Asmodean? Which, in fairness, when you have pathological imposter syndrome to the point where you need to sell your soul so you have enough time to get good enough, only to wake up where everyone sucks, and no one's opinion matters, and you're fucked and holding on to a metaphorical tuft of grass. Oh, and doomed to go crazy as well because some dumbass shepherd decided it would be a good idea to cut you off from the Dark One and then keeps giving you previews of what your future might look like. Yeah, that would be pretty fucking hard. Rand has no sympathy for Asmodean's plight and is content to have him pay the price for his choices. He does not make Asmodean ride a mule or carry the banner with the ancient symbol of the Aes Sedai on it to humiliate him. He's riding a mule because there weren't any horses, and he's carrying the banner because the pool of wetlanders Rand has to pick from is small, and Asmodean's the only one he feels comfortable making the demand of. And if it just so happens that it does humiliate Asmodean, well, Rand looked into his purse, and behold, it is empty of fucks. He's like, "You carry it because you were chosen, because the choices you made put you here. You have no one but yourself to blame, and I don't give a shit what you don't like." We also see here that Rand is very invested in Asmodean knowing that this impulse to go hard and basically punish Asmodean because he's frustrated is pure Rand al'Thor. There's nobody in his head telling him, "Be a dick to Asmo, Rand, he's an asshole." There's nobody in his head telling him things that Asmodean has done that Rand al'Thor should not know, which it never occurred to me before this might be something that Asmodean is genuinely alarmed about. The more that he sees that Rand might know things that someone of this age shouldn't know, the more he might know crimes that Asmodean would never want anybody in this age to be aware of or to be called to account for. So maybe it's a little reassuring to have Rand make plain to him, "It's just me here, fed up with you and not willing to put up with bullshit. So stand the straight and narrow, do what I need you to do, and don't stab me in the back, and I'll give you a little bit of freedom to move and breathe. But if you fuck me over, then yeah, I will bury you." And that has nothing to do with being crazy and everything to do with who I am and where I'm at. The next chapter is called Bird Calls by Night, and Jordan explores a little bit more of the weird dynamic where Asmodean sees Lews Therin peek through and Rand tries to pretend that it's not happening. This chapter starts from Matt's perspective. We get the bulk of the Trolloc attack through his eyes. This is the first attempt to bait Rand, with Dark Friends fighting alongside, making sure to call out Samael and the Golden Bees. When we switch to Rand, we get a double Drakkar attack against him and Avienda. They kill them, and in the process, he manages to offend her. And so afterwards, she's hiding in the tent, and Rand is standing outside in his stocking feet, waiting, and he's afraid he's going to see her naked. So he's finally like, fuck this noise, and he decides to go for a walk. And it says, Asmodean's tent was not very far from his. There had not been a sound out of it. He whipped open the flap and ducked in. Asmodean was sitting in the dark, chewing his lip. He flinched when Rand appeared and gave him no chance to speak. You did not expect me to take a hand, did you? I felt the Drakkar, but you could deal with those. You did. I've never liked Drakkar. We should never have made them. They have fewer brains than a Trolloc. Give them an order, and they still sometimes kill whatever is closest. If I had come out, if I had done something, what if someone noticed? What if they realized it could not be you channeling? Well, for you that you didn't. Rand cut him off, sitting cross-legged in the dark. If I had felt you full of sardine out there tonight, I might have killed you. The other man's laugh was shaky. I thought of that, too. It was Samael who sent the attack tonight. The Trollocs and Dark Friends, anyway. It is not like Samael to throw men away, Asmodean said slowly. But he'll see 10,000 dead, or 10 times that if it gains him what he thinks is worth the cost. Maybe one of the others wants you to think it was him. Even if the Aiel took prisoners, Trollocs do not think of much besides killing, and Dark Friends believe what they are told. It was him. He tried to bait me into attacking him once in the same way at Serendahar. Oh, light. The thought drifted across the surface of the void. I said me. He did not know where Serendahar had been, or anything but what he had said. The words had just come out. After a long silence, Asmodean said, I never knew that. What I want to know is why. Rand chose his words carefully, hoping that they were all his. He remembered Samael's face. A man, not mine, not my memory. A compact man with a short yellow beard. Asmodean had described all the Forsaken, but he knew this image was not made from that description. Samael had always wanted to be taller, and resented it that the power could not make him so. Asmodean had never told him that. From what you've told me, he is not likely to want to face me unless he is sure of victory, and maybe not then. You said he'd likely leave me to the Dark One if he could, so why is he sure he'll win now if I decide to go after him? They discussed it in the dark for hours without coming to any conclusion. Asmodean held to the opinion that it had been one of the others, hoping to send Rand against Samael and thus get rid of one or both. At least Asmodean said that he did. Rand could feel the man's dark eyes on him, wondering. That slip had been too big to cover. There's a lot of good stuff here. Firstly, there's still a marked sense of separation, an almost detached way that Rand looks at Lews Therin Telemon's memories and thinks it's not him. By book 6, it will be a constant, frantic war of I'm alive and you're dead, I'm alive and you're dead, like actual interactions with Lews Therin. Is he talking to me? You cooperate with me. But here Lews Therin slips in, and then Rand has to shake himself and be like, but that's not me. Because Lews Therin's presence is not yet constant, not palpable and insistent the way he'll become, there's an ethereal barrier to the tone Jordan uses in writing. It's so subtle, and that's something where I don't think he could have done it with intention. He just have to have breathed it and lived it, because it's not the type of writing that you could ever think, this is how I will make this. This is how I will draw that line. It's just something that he wrote from the heart, and it's beautiful. Next, I like how RJ makes it a point to show Rand, after the first of what will be many attempts to be baited into attacking Samael, talk out with someone who might know the answer to try to figure what's the purpose of this attack. And Asmodean is like, Samael? Okay, you say it's him, but it's such a waste, so I don't think that's right. I think it's others who are trying to make you think that it's him and send you against him. So Asmodean totally sees this plot that his frenemies are hatching. He just couldn't guess that Samael would be in on it. And if he could have been a fly on the wall in that meeting in the prologue where Lanfear throws him under the bus, he'd probably be happy to see that he's not the only Forsaken stupid enough to risk plotting with Lanfear. And it might give him just a little flush of pleasure to know that she plans to stab all of them in the back, and he might feel a smidge better knowing her betrayal wasn't personal. Or maybe not. The next chapter, The Fifth I Give You, skips ahead to a few days later where Rand and crew are coming out of the Jangai Pass on the Kyrian side, and we are in Egwene's head. Half the chapters in this second section of Rand's story belong to Egwene. Robert Jordan uses her to make some crucial observations about Rand's development while she's with him through the 4th, 5th, and 6th books, though they are strongly colored by the perceptions of someone who is alarmed at the changes that she's seeing in her friend. Here she observes as Rand is talking to the chiefs, telling them they'll get the fifth, but none can be food, and there's to be no burning, no murder or mayhem. There's an expectation that they will treat the Kyrianin with respect, and the rules apply to every clan. And it says, Egwene drew breath. Those men were all old enough to be his father and more, leaders of their people as surely as kings for all they disclaimed it, hardened leaders in battle. It seemed only yesterday that he had been a boy in more than age, a youth who asked and hoped rather than commanded and expected to be obeyed. He was changing faster than she could keep up with now. A good thing if he kept these men from doing to other cities what Couladin had done to Tain and Salian. She told herself that. She only wished he could do it without showing more arrogance every day. How soon before he expected her to obey him as Moraine did, or all Aes Sedai? She hoped it was only arrogance. And Egwene's struggles with Rand's changes and his with hers are a subject for an episode about their relationship. So I won't delve into it except to say that Egwene sees justice here, but struggles to see the gentle friend that she grew up with and once thought she'd marry do something as hard as dispense it. And a couple of chapters later, Jordan has Elaine put it in perspective for Egwene during their meeting in Tel Iran Riyadh. Elaine asks if Rand is well, and it says, He is alive and unharmed, if that is what you mean. I thought he was hard in Tyr, but today I heard him threaten to hang men if they go against his commands. Not that they are bad orders. He won't let anyone take food without paying or murder people, but it's still. They were the first to hail him as he who comes with the dawn. They followed him out of the waste without hesitation, and he threatened them as hard as cold steel. Not a threat, Egwene. He is a king, whatever you or he or anyone else says, and a king or queen must dispense justice without fear of enemies or favor for friends. Anyone who does that has to be hard. Mother can make the city walls seem soft sometimes. He doesn't have to be so arrogant about it, Egwene said levelly. Nynaeve said I should remind him he's only a man, but I've not figured out how yet. He does have to remember he is only a man, but he has a right to expect to be obeyed. There was something of a haughty tone to Elaine's voice until she glanced down at herself. And looking at her clothes changes her tone because RJ loves to use the world of dreams to show off how thirsty the Supergirls are, and just before Elaine inquired about Rand's well-being, her outfit turned super slutty. Later on, we get an update from Nynaeve's point of view about this justice that Rand is not a threatening to dispense. Egwene passes on through Elaine as they're moving through Cairhien that Rand is hanging bandits and watching the executions, and Nynaeve is super disturbed about it because it is so contrary to the nice boy she watched grow up. She thinks to herself that his trip through the waste changed him for the worse, and is exasperated that the important takeaway Elaine got from Egwene's news, her great concern, is that her mother's soldiers are in Cairhien. Nynaeve can't fathom that. She's like, yo, if people will attest that a person has committed a hangable offense, your boyfriend's killing them, like, without a thought. And Elaine's just sort of like, shrug. Yeah, fucker, it's called being a king. It goes with the territory. You know it doesn't go with the territory? Queen's Guards in Cairhien. What the actual fuck is up with that? RJ takes a short break in Saladar, and we have the 3 chapters, Salidara, The Practice of Diffidence, and Trapped. And then we're back in Cairhien. The third cluster of these chapters in Rand's arc starts with chapter 29, Memories of Saldaea. This chapter is from Hadden and Kadir's point of view and sets up the scene that will play out down at the docks with Lanfear. Kadir is contemplating a dark friend note written with Aiel-style lettering that says, "You're not alone among strangers. A way has been chosen," and wondering why he's getting it now when they're most of the way across Cairhien. So it's a really good way of letting us know how far they've traveled between the end of the last cluster of chapters and this one, and it's also a great way to prep us for the appearance of an Aiel dark friend. Kadir tells us that it's been 2 months since Rand captured Asmodean, which also lets us know that it's been 1 month since they left Rhuidean. RJ sets up the scene at the docks by having Kadir think about how Lanfear has tasked him with keeping an eye on Rand. Isendra shows up at Kadir's wagon, having just been caught yet again by the maidens trying to sneak to Rand. She's been trying to get into his bed on Kadir's orders in order to follow Lanfear's orders and keep an eye on Rand. This time the maidens have shaved her bald and beat her with nettles. They've broken her nerve and threatened her with Avienda, and when Kadir doesn't understand why Avienda is a threat, she tells him that Rand and Avienda have been fucking, which they haven't even yet, and she has a meltdown, so Kadir murders her. Then we switch to Rand's point of view for the next chapter. As or shortly after Kadir is strangling Isendra, Rand is killing time chilling on a bridge in the town of Ianrod when the Aiel approach him with a bunch of soldiers. It says, "He heard the ring of horses' hooves walking down the stone-paved street toward the bridge. Every maiden was upright in an instant, face veiled, half-knocked arrows. His hand went to his waist by instinct, but the sword was not there. The Aiel felt strange enough about him riding a horse and carrying the thing at his saddle. He had not seen any need to offend their customs more by wearing it. Besides, there were not many horses, and they were coming at a walk. When they appeared, surrounded by an escort of 50 Aiel, the riders numbered fewer than 20, slumping in their saddles dejectedly. Most wore rimmed helmets and Terran coats with puffy striped sleeves beneath their breastplates. The pair in the lead had ornately gilded cuirasses and large white plumes attached to the front of their helmets, and the stripes on their sleeves had the glisten of satin in the moonlight. Half a dozen men at the rear, though, shorter and slighter than the Terrans, two with small banners called Khan on short staffs harnessed to their backs, wore dark coats and helmets shaped like bells cut away to expose their faces. Cairhien used the banners to pick out officers in battle, and also to mark a lord's personal retainers. The Terrans with plumes stared when they saw him, exchanged startled glances, then scrambled down to come kneel before him, helmets under their arms. They were young, little older than he, both with dark beards trimmed to neat points in the fashion of Terran nobility. Dents marred their breastplates, and the gilding was chipped. They had been crossing swords somewhere. Neither so much as glanced at the Aiel surrounding them, as if when ignored they would disappear. The maidens unveiled, though they looked no less ready to put spear or arrow through the kneeling men. Rourke followed the Terrans, with a gray-eyed Aiel younger and slightly taller than he, and stood behind. Mangan was of the Jindo Tardad, and one of those who had gone to the Stone of Tyr. Jindo had brought in the riders. "My Lord Dragon," the plump, peach-cheeked lordling said, "burn my soul, but have they taken you prisoner?" His companion, jug ears and potato nose making him look a farmer despite his beard, kept sweeping lanky hair from his forehead nervously. "They said they were taking us to some Dawn fellow, the Karakarn. Means something about chiefs, if I remember what my tutor said. Forgive me, my Lord Dragon, I am a Dorian of House Salorna, and this is Estian of House Andiama." "I am he who comes with the dawn," Rand told them quietly, "and the Karakarn." He had them placed now, young lords who had spent their time drinking, gambling, and chasing women when he was in the stone. Estien's eyes nearly popped out of his face. A Dorian looked as surprised for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if he suddenly saw how it made sense. "Stand. Stand. Who are your Cairhien companions? It would be interesting to meet Cairhien who were not running for their lives from the Shido and any other Aiel they saw. For that matter, if they were with a Dorian and Estian, they might be the first supporters he had met in this land. If the two Terrans' fathers had followed his orders, bring them forward." Estian blinked his surprise as he rose, but a Dorian barely paused in turning to shout, "Marison! Darakain! Come here!" much like calling dogs. The Kyrianins' banners bobbed as they dismounted slowly. "My Lord Dragon," Estienne hesitated, licking his lips as though thirsty, "did you send the Aiel against Cairien?" "They've attacked the city, then?" Rourke nodded, and Mangan said, "If these are to be believed, Cairien still holds, or did 3 days ago." There was little doubt that he did not think it still did, and less that he cared about a city of tree killers. "I did not send them, Estienne," Rand said as they were joined by 2 Kyrianen who knelt, doffing their helmets to reveal men of an age with Dorian and Estienne, their hair shaved back in line with their ears, and their dark eyes wary. "Those who attack the city are my enemies, the Shido. I mean to save Cairien if it can be saved." He had to go through the business of telling the Kyrianen to rise. His time with the Aiel had almost made him forget the habit this side of the spine of the world, bowing and kneeling right and left. He had to ask for introductions, too, and the Kyrianen gave them themselves. Lieutenant Lord Merison of House Daganred. His con was all wavy vertical lines of red and white, and Lieutenant Lord Darracane of House Anilin, his con covered with small squares of red and black. It was a surprise that they were lords. Though lords commanded and led soldiers in Cairien, they did not shape their heads and become soldiers, or had not. Much had changed, apparently. "My Lord Dragon," Marison stumbled a bit saying that. He and Darracane were both pale, slender men with narrow faces and long noses, but he was a bit the heavier. Neither looked as if he had had much to eat lately. Marison rushed on as if afraid of being interrupted. "My Lord Dragon, Cairien can hold for days yet, perhaps as many as 10 or 12, but you must come quickly if you were to save it." "That is why we came out," Estienne said, shooting Marison a dark look. Both Kyrianen returned it, but their defiance was tinged with resignation. Estienne raked stringy hair from his forehead. "To find help. Parties have been sent in every direction, my Lord Dragon." He shivered, despite the sweat on his brow, and his voice turned distant and hollow. "There were more of us when we started. I saw a baron go down, screaming with a spear through his guts. He'll never turn a card at Chop again. I could use mug-strawn brandy." Adorian turned his helmet and gauntleted hands, frowning. "My Lord Dragon, the city can hold a while longer, but even if these Aiel will fight those, the question is, can you bring them there in time? I think 10 or 12 days is a more than generous estimate myself. In truth, I only came because I thought dying with a spear through me would be better than being taken alive when they made it over the walls. The city is packed with refugees who fled ahead of the Aiel. There isn't a dog or a pigeon left in the city, and I doubt there will be a rat left soon. The one good thing is that no one seems to be worrying very much about who will take the Sun Throne, not with this Couladin outside." There is so much to love about this whole bit. First off, Jordan takes 2 characters in Adorian and Estienne, who were introduced to us in The Shadow Rising as shitheads, and he gives them the opportunity to show themselves capable of something more than snobbish douchebaggery, a chance for some small redemption. We interact with so many nobles, and statistically not all of them can be 100% garbage, so Jordan is able to explore the nuance of privilege, because they're still assholes, as shown by the way that they treat the Kyrianen, who are undoubtedly also shitheads to the people below them in turn. But Estienne and Adorian are assholes with potential, and RJ sets them up here, even going so far as to highlight that Adorian has a brain. After he has a second to think about it, it makes total sense to him that the Karakarn would be Rand. Rand sent all of these nobles from Tyr into Cairien, led by the High Lord Mylon and financed by Estienne's father Torian. Sent them where they had power to gain, and he knew that they would use that opportunity to do so. So RJ gives us a preview of the dynamic that we'll encounter once we reach the city, with the Terrans lording it over the Kyrianen, showing it playing out on even the lower levels among nobles who don't really matter. Because while Adorian and Estienne especially are wealthy and the sons of powerful men, they themselves are not much more than officers who happen to be nobles. At the point that Tarmangaiden is on the horizon, that's what they are, even if they don't yet know it. Marison and Darracane, the Kyrianen soldiers, have had a year for that to sink in, that yes, we are noblemen, but really, we're more soldiers. The nobility is incidental at this point. The end of the world is here. Hence the fashion of the soldiers' shaven heads that the young lords have. Umbrian is such a shit show, and the Terrans are such assholes that the simple kindness and respect Rand shows to the Kyrianan of treating them as Adorian and Estian's equals, despite the Terrans' attempt to erode their power, earns Rand fierce loyalty from these young nobles who left the city because dying looking for help is better than waiting to die. It says, "It isn't how fast we can make it," Rand said quietly, "but how fast you can, if you dismount some of your men and use their horses for spares. I want to let Mylon and Kyrian know that help is on the way, but whoever goes will have to be sure he can keep his mouth shut if the Shido take him. I do not intend to let Couladin know any more than he can learn on his own." Estian went whiter in the face than the Kyrianan. Marison and Derricane were on their knees together, each seizing one of Rand's hands to kiss. He let them, with as much patience as he could find. One bit of Moraine's advice that had the ring of common sense was not to offend people's customs, however strange or even repulsive, unless you absolutely had to, and even then to think twice. "We will go, my Lord Dragon," Marison said breathlessly. "Thank you, my Lord Dragon. Thank you. Under the light I vow I will die before revealing a word to any but my father or the High Lord Mylon." "Grace favor you, my Lord Dragon," the other added. "Grace favor you, and the light illumine you forever. I am your man to the death." Rand let Marison say that he was also Rand's man before taking his hands back firmly and telling them to stand. He did not like the way they were looking at him. Adorian had called them like hounds, but men should not look at anyone as if they were dogs gazing at a master. So this is really unnerving and uncomfortable for Rand, who is just an ordinary guy with a fundamental sense of decency, doing everything he can to give succor and aid to his people, and he's so awkward and pure in this moment, and it's really sweet. And then Rand goes to his room, and there's chasing of Avienda, and sexcapades ensue, and I don't have much to say about that. I think the scene is honestly pretty cute, and a lot of it is very well written, but I'm not actually interested in doing any kind of an exploration of it. What I will talk about is the journey back to the gateway after they're done in the sex igloo. Rand realizes that they're in Shanshan when he cuts open the door of the igloo and leans out and sees a Rakan or a Torakan fly over. So they sneak back to the gateway, where Asmodean has obscured the opening so that it just looks like a dark space, and they see a bunch of Shanshan staring at the darkness. There's about 20 soldiers, a member of the Blood named Lady Morsa, a seeker for the truth named Jalindon, and two sets of Suldam and Damani, who can presumably see the weave of Avienda's gateway as well as the darkness that is the backside of a weave Asmodean is using so that no Gaishain or maidens can see the gateway on the Ianrod side. So Rand has Avienda shield the Damani and Suldam. He freezes everybody with air, and they come out of hiding, and he tries to free a Damani because he's like, hey, they're prisoners, but a male channeler touching the collar causes it to hurt the both of them and makes the power pour dangerously into all three, so he has Avienda try to free her instead. And this lady Morsa recognizes Rand, and he sees that she recognizes him, and so they're having a conversation, and there's talk of Falma and what he did, and one of the Suldam makes it clear that Rand can channel, and Avi mentions that she could feel the power pouring into both the Suldam and the Damani when he touched the collar, and just hearing the bits and pieces of the conversation, this seeker Jalindon intuits that there are secrets being kept about the return and Falma that shouldn't have been kept, and also that the Suldam and the Damani have secrets, and so she makes a power play and decides to arrest the Suldam and Damani and the Lady Morsa. It says, she looked as if she wanted to scream, yet she accepted. Jalindon's gaze turned to Rand. She named you Rand al'Thor. You will be well treated if you surrender to me, Rand al'Thor. However you came here, you cannot think to escape, even if you kill us. There is a wide search for a Marath Damani who channeled in the night. Her eyes flickered to Avienda. It will find you as well, inevitably, and you might be slain by accident. There is sedition in this district. I do not know how men like you were treated in your lands, but in Shanshan your sufferings can be eased. Here you can find great honor in the use of your power. He laughed at her, and she looked offended. I cannot kill you, but I vow I should stripe your hide, at least for that. He certainly would not have to worry about being gentled in Shanshan hands. In Shanshan, men who could channel were killed, not executed, hunted and shot down on sight. The gray-filled gateway was another finger narrower, barely wide enough now for both of them to pass through together. Leave her, Avienda. We have to go now. She released Ceri's collar and gave him an exasperated look, but her eyes went past him to the gateway, and she hoisted her skirts to stump through the snow to him, muttering to herself about frozen water. Be ready for anything, he told her, putting an arm around her shoulders. He told himself they had to be close together to fit, not because she felt good. I don't know what, but be ready. She nodded, and he said, Jump. Together they leaped into the grayness, Rand releasing the weave that had held the Shanshan in order to fill himself to bursting with Sidene, and landed stumbling in his bedchamber in Ianrod, lamp-lit with darkness outside the windows. Asmodean sat against the wall beside the door with his legs crossed. He was not embracing the source, but Rand slammed a block between the man and Sidene anyway. Whirling with his arms still around Avienda, he found the gateway gone. No, not gone. He could still see his weaving and what he knew must be Asmodean's, but there seemed to be nothing there at all. Without pause he slashed the weave, and suddenly the gateway appeared, a rapidly narrowing view of Shanshan, the Lady Morsa slumped in her saddle, Jalindon shouting orders. A green and white tasseled spear lanced through the opening just before it snapped shut. Instinctively Rand channeled air to snatch the suddenly wobbling 2-foot length of spear. The shaft ended as smoothly as any craftsman could have worked it. Shivering, he was glad that he had not tried removing the gray barrier, whatever it had been, before jumping through. A good thing neither of the Suldam recovered in time, he said, taking the severed spear in his hand, or we'd have had worse than this coming after us. He watched Asmodean from the corner of his eye, but the man only sat there looking slightly ill. He could not know whether Rand meant to stuff that spear down his throat. Avienda's sniff was her most pointed yet. Do you think I released them? She said heatedly. She removed his arm firmly, but he did not think her temper was for him, or not for his arm anyway. I tied their shields as tightly as I could. They are your enemies, Rand al'Thor, even the ones you call Damani, or faithful dogs who would have killed you rather than be free. You must be hard with your enemies, not soft. She was right, he thought, hefting the spear. He had left enemies behind that he might well have to face one day. He had to become harder, or else he would be ground to flour before he ever reached Shale Ghul. So then Rand asks Avienda to fuck off for the rest of the night, and it says, bouncing the shortened spear in his hand, he turned to Asmodean. Strange scepter, my Lord Dragon. It will do for one, to remind him that the Shanshan were still out there. For once, he wished his voice was even colder than the void and Sidene made it. He had to be hard. Before I decide whether to skewer you with it like a lamb, why did you never mention this trick of making something invisible? If I hadn't been able to see the flows, I'd never have known the gateway was still there. Asmodean swallowed, shifting as though he did not know whether Rand meant his threat. Rand was not sure himself. My Lord Dragon, you never asked. A matter of bending light. You always have so many questions, it is hard to find a moment to speak of anything else. You must realize by now that I've thrown my lot in with yours completely. Licking his lips, he got up, as far as his knees, and began to babble. I felt your weave. Anybody within a mile could have felt it. I never saw anything like it. I didn't know that anyone but Demondred could block a gateway that was closing, and maybe Semiraj and Lews Therin. I felt it and came, and a hard time I had getting past those maidens. I used the same trick. You must know I am your man now. My Lord Dragon, I am your man. It was the repetition of what the Kyrian had said that got through as much as anything else. Gesturing with the half-spear, he said roughly, Stand! You aren't a dog. But as Asmodean slowly rose, he laid the long spear point alongside the Rand's throat. He had to be hard. From now on, you will tell me 2 things I don't ask about every time we talk. Every time, mind. If I think you were trying to hide anything from me, you will be glad to let Semiraj have you. As you say, my Lord Dragon, Asmodean stammered. He looked ready to bow and kiss Rand's hand. To avoid the chance, Rand moved to the blanketless bed and sat on the linen sheet, the feather mattresses yielding under him as he studied the spear. A good idea to keep it for remembrance, if not as a scepter. Even with everything else, he had best not forget the Shanshan. Those Damani. If Avienda had not been there to block them from the source. You've tried showing me how to shield a woman and failed. Try showing me how to avoid flows I cannot see, how to counter them. Once Lanfear had sliced his weavings as neatly as with a knife. Not easy, my Lord Dragon, without a woman to practice against. We have 2 hours, Rand said coldly, letting the man's shield unravel. Try. Try very hard. So Rand takes that lesson to heart fast. You've got to be hard with your enemies. He and Avienda had to go through this gateway blind because he didn't know what Asmodean's weave was for, or whether it would be harmful or even fatal. And it seems to have finally dawned on him that despite the casual way that he behaves around this Forsaken, Asmodean is not his ally and doesn't deserve pity. And it's time to make some real demands of him, force him to step up his game, make a fucking effort, and come up with some actual lesson plans rather than slacking and making half-assed excuses like, I told you I'm not a very good teacher. We switched to Nynaeve and crew for 8 chapters in Samara, starting out with Tom throwing knives at Nynaeve, proceeding to the conflict with Moghedien and Brigida being ripped away, and ending with Nynaeve sending both Galad and Massima looking for a boat. And then we get to our 4th section of Rand's story in chapters 41 through 46, which cover the battle in Cairhien and are from his and Matt's perspectives. So, Chapter 41 starts with Rand looking at the 3 separate camps of his soldiers, Aiel, Terrans, and Cairhien, and he's listening to High Lord Wiraman being a douchebag. Wiraman is not part of the original 7 High Lords that are led by High Lord Mylon and sent into Cairhien on Rand's orders. This is actually our first encounter with him. We don't even know if he was in the stone when it fell. He's a new problem, and he came into Cairhien on his own initiative, presumably looking for power, or he might possibly have come under orders, as we must assume he is the High Lord whose spurs are seen by Jacob Carradine in the Darfkren Social at the beginning of Book 2. Wiraman presents as this blustering idiot who may only be pretending to be stupid as he puts forth disastrous military advice, which is how we first meet him, insisting that he can disperse the Shido with just his cavalry. It says, Rand had heard as much of this as he could stomach. You were certain of the news you bring from Tyr. Wiraman blinked. News, my Lord Dragon? What? Oh, that! Burn my soul, there's nothing to that. Illianer pirates often try to raid along the coast. They were more than trying by what the man had said when he arrived. And the attacks on the plains of Moredo, do they often do that as well? Why, burn my soul, those are just brigands. It was more statement of fact than protest. Perhaps not Illianers at all, but certainly not soldiers. The jumble those Illianers make of things, who can say whether king or assemblage or council of 9 has the whip hand on any given day? Yet if they do decide to move, it will be armies striking at Tyr under the golden bees, not raiders burning merchants' wagons and border farms. You can mark me on that. If you wish it, Rand replied as politely as he could. Whatever power the assemblage or the Council of 9 or Matt and Stepanios den Balgar had, it was what Samael chose to leave them. So RJ mostly uses Wiraman here to tell us that continued baiting of Rand is happening on the whole Samael front. And then a little bit further on, we get... On the highest part of the hill, a heavy framework tower of logs thrust above the treetops, the white platform on the top 20 spans or more above the ground. The Aiel knew nothing about working with wood on that scale, but there had been plenty among the Cairhien refugees who did. Moraine was waiting at the base of the first slanting ladder with Lon and Egwene. Egwene had been getting a good bit of sun. She really could have passed for Aiel, except for her dark eyes. A short Aiel. He scanned her face quickly, but detected nothing except tiredness. Amis and the others must be working her too hard with her training. She would not thank him for interceding, though. Have you decided? Rand asked, stopping. Wiraman fell silent at last. Egwene hesitated, but Rand noted that she did not look at Moraine before nodding. I will do what I can. Her reluctance bothered him. He had not asked Moraine. She could not use the One Power as a weapon against the Shido, not unless they threatened her or he managed to convince her they were all dark friends. But Egwene had not taken the 3 oaths, and he had been sure she would see the necessity. Instead, she had gone white-faced when he suggested it, and had avoided him for 3 days, until now. At least she had agreed. Whatever made the fight shorter against the Shido must be for the good. Moraine's face never changed, though she had no doubt what she thought. Those smooth Aes Sedai features, those Aes Sedai eyes, could register icy disapproval without altering a jot. So Rand is not only using people, he's no longer trying to avoid making use of the people who matter to him. He needs channelers to aid him, but Moraine can't, and the Wise Ones don't take part in battle yet, and so to him it's logical to ask Egwene. And he's annoyed with her reluctance, which is super unfair. Not just because using the power to kill people is antithetical to the core values of the Aes Sedai she longs to be, but because she was trained in combat magic by the Shanshen, and making use of those weaves will likely be traumatic. But I understand Rand's position, because the faster the battle is over, the fewer deaths and the less suffering. And I'm not judging him for being frustrated at her reluctance. It's not like he's being a dick about it, but he doesn't reflect at all about what it really means to ask someone who is not that type of soldier to kill offensively. And that lack of consideration shows where Rand is, because Book 4 Rand would probably have given thought to the reasons behind Egwene's reaction, wondering why she was going white, thinking of all the things that she'd been through, and realizing what an emotionally costly thing that he's asking. Book 5 Rand doesn't have it in him to wonder. Rand's use of Egwene, at least this first time, is a straightforward request. The first instance of him using Mat starts with a manipulation to see how he can use him. Chapter 42 starts from Mat's perspective, the morning of the battle. He knows it's going to be a shit show, and he does not want to be here for it, and feels no tug to make him stay, so he goes to Rand's tent to say goodbye, and Rand's not there. To kill time, he studies the battle map, and Lon comes in and chats him up, coaxing him into general mode, and Mat says a whole bunch of generally shit, and then Rand shows up. Mat says goodbye, and we switch to Rand's point of view. It says, Rand stood staring after Mat, long after the tent flaps had fallen to hide him. I only heard the last bit, he said finally. Was it all like that? Very nearly, Lon replied. With only a few minutes to study the maps he laid out close to the battle plan that Rourke and the others made. He saw the difficulties and the dangers and how to meet them. He knows about miners and siege engines, and using light cavalry to harry a defeated foe. Rand looked at him. The warder showed no surprise, not the twitch of an eyelash. Of course, he was the one who had said Mat seemed surprisingly knowledgeable about military matters. And Lon was not going to ask the obvious question either, which was good. Rand had no right to give the little answer he had. And a bit further it says, the important thing was that he knew Mat had gained more on the other side of that doorway to Rangriel than a tendency to spout the old tongue when not thinking. And knowing that, Rand would surely make use of it. You don't have to get any harder, he thought bitterly. He had seen Mat climbing toward this tent, and never hesitated in sending Lon in to discover what might come to the surface in idle conversation alone. That had been deliberate. The rest might or might not be, but it would happen. He hoped Mat had a fine time while he was free. He hoped the Perrin was enjoying himself in the Two Rivers, showing off Fail to his mother and sisters, maybe marrying her. He hoped it because he knew he would draw them back, ta'Veren pulling at ta'Veren, and he the strongest. Moraine had named it no coincidence, 3 such growing up in the same village, all nearly the same age. The wheel wove happenstance and coincidence into the pattern, but it did not lay down the likes of the 3 of them for no reason. Eventually he would pull his friends back to him, however far they went, and when they came he would use them, however he could, however he had to, because he did have to. Because whatever the prophecy of the dragon said, he was sure the only chance he had of winning Tarmangaiden lay in having all 3 of them, 3 ta'Veren who had been tied together since infancy, tied together once more. No, he did not need to become hard. You're rank enough already to make a Shanshan spew his supper. Play March of Death, he commanded in a harsher voice than he wanted, and Nateo looked at him blankly for a moment. The man had been listening to everything. He would have questions, but he would find no answers. If Rand could not tell Lon Mat's secrets, he would not spread them before one of the Forsaken, however tame he appeared. This time he deliberately made his tone rough, and pointed the length of spear at the man. Play it, unless you know a satyr. Play something to make your soul weep, if you have one still." Mateo gave him an ingratiating smile and a seated bow, but he went white around the eyes. It was indeed the march of death that he began, yet it had a sharper edge on his harp than ever before, a dirge-like keen that surely would make any soul weep. He stared fixedly at Rand as if hoping to see some effect. Turning away, Rand stretched out on the carpets with his head to the maps and a red and gold cushion under his elbow. "Lon, would you ask the others to come in now?" The warder made a formal bow before stepping outside. It was the first time that he had ever done that, but Rand noticed only absently. The battle would begin tomorrow. It was a polite fiction that he had helped Rourke and the others plan. He was smart enough to know what he did not know, and despite all of his talks with Lon and Rourke, he knew he was not ready. "I've planned 100 battles this size or more, and given orders that led to 10 times as many." Not his thought. Lews Therin knew war, had known war, but not Rand al'Thor, that was him. He listened, asked questions, and nodded as if he understood when the chief said a thing should be done a certain way. Sometimes he did understand and wished he did not, because he knew where that understanding came from. His only real contribution had been to say Couladin had to be defeated without destroying the city. In any case, this meeting would only add a few touches at most to what had already been decided. Matt would have been useful with his newfound knowledge. No, he would not think of his friends, of what he would do to them before it was all done. Even leaving the battle aside, there was plenty to occupy him, things he could do something about. The absence of Kyrian and flags above Kyrian marked a major problem, and the continued skirmishes with Andorans another. What Samael was up to warranted thought, and this relatively short perspective is one of the best Rand bits in the book. We see Rand is full of anger and self-loathing, and he takes it out on Asmodean, who is the one person that Rand is ever really comfortable punching down at, though he's often disgusted with himself when he does it. But right now he's even more disgusted by how casually and thoughtlessly he manipulated Matt. And so he rips into Asmodean because there's at least one person in this tent who's a more garbage human than Rand al'Thor. Jordan shows us more great stuff in this scene. Rand has begun to casually give orders to Lon, and Lon in turn gives him respect, acknowledging his kingliness, which has grown throughout the book. And Lews Therin is here the whole time, of course, and the great division of Lews Therin knew war, but not Rand al'Thor, and that was him. There's this sense of slipping here, and before long we're going to go from consistent, intrusive thoughts to a real voice and a presence with agency. We're still in Rand's head at the beginning of the next chapter, which is the following morning. And we get that Rand hasn't slept, and his morning is made worse by the discovery that his clever plan to keep the maidens out of the fighting by having them guard Egwene and Aviendha at the tower has backfired, ruining his other plan to sneak off and duel Couladin. He steps out of the tent, and there are Egwene, Avi, and all of the maidens surrounding him and insisting that they're there to take him to the tower with the other two. And when he protests, all he gets is Vardarai Mai carries the honor of the Karakarn. So all 3 glass cannons go to the tower. The channelers climb up to the platform, the army of guards surround the base, and the women get the battle started with lightning and earth explosions. And it says, at this distance, there were limits to what he could do. In fact, it was about as far as he could do anything, really, without Angriel or Sa-Angriel. Very likely that was why the women were channeling one lightning bolt at a time, one explosion. If he was at his boundary, they must be stretching theirs. A memory slid across the emptiness. Not his, Lews Therin's. For once he did not care. In an instant he channeled, and a ball of fire enveloped the top of a hill nearly 5 miles away, a churning mass of pale yellow flame. When it faded, he could see without the looking-glass that the hill was lower now and black at the crest, seemingly melted. Between the 3 of them there might be no need for the clans to fight Couladin at all. "Ilyena, my love, forgive me." The void trembled. For an instant Rand teetered on the brink of destruction. Waves of the one power crashed through him in a froth of fear. The taint seemed to solidify around his heart, a reeking stone. Clutching the rail until his knuckles ached, he forced himself back to calmness, forced the emptiness to hold. Thereafter he refused to listen to the thoughts in his head. Instead he concentrated everything on channeling, on methodically searing one hill after another. One of the ways that RJ makes the presence of Lews Therin more palpable and decreases the sense of detachment or separation between him and Rand is just to increase Rand's distress when he appears. This situation on the tower shows some contrast where before Lews Therin's commentary was fairly neutral in tone, now he's upset and it's making Rand upset. Rand mirrors Lews Therin's emotions, and as Rand goes more insane, so does he. We're in Matt's head for the rest of the chapter, and then at the start of chapter 44, we're back on the tower with Rand, where RJ gives him a trolley problem. It says, a milling mass right at the city's high gray wall caught his eye. Tall iron-bound gates stood open, Aiel battling horsemen and spearmen almost in the open, while folk tried to close the gates, tried and failed because of the press of bodies. Horses with empty saddles and armored men unmoving on the ground half a mile from the gate marked where the sortie had been driven back. Arrows rained down from the walls, and head-sized chunks of rubble, even occasional spears slashing down with enough force to spit 2 men or 3, though he still could not see from where exactly, but the Aiel were going over their dead, ever closer to forcing their way in. A quick scan showed him 2 more columns of Aiel trotting toward the gates, perhaps 3,000 all told. He did not doubt they were Cúladins as well. He was aware of grinding his teeth. If the Shido got inside Cairhien, he would never drive them north. He would have to dig them out street by street. The cost in lives would dwarf the number of those already dead, and the city itself would end a ruin like Ianrod, if not Tain. Cairhien and Shido were mingled like ants in a bowl, but he had to do something. Taking a deep breath, he channeled. The 2 women had set the conditions, bringing the storm clouds. He did not need to be able to see their wavings to take advantage of them. Stark, silver-blue lightning struck into the Aiel once, twice, again, as fast as a man could clap. Rand jerked his head up, blinking away the burning lines that still seemed to cross his sight, and when he looked through the long tube again, Shido lay like cut barley all around where the bolts had fallen. Men and horses thrashed on the ground close to the gates, too, and some did not move at all, but the uninjured were dragging the injured, and the gates were beginning to close. How many won't make it back inside? How many of my own did I kill? The cold truth was that it did not matter. It had had to be done, and it was done. This scene always strikes me because of what it says about Robert Jordan's understanding of war and the horrible choices people are often faced with. Necessary friendly fire is not something that's really talked about. It's a thing that's blanketed by terms like acceptable losses or collateral damage. But RJ would have known of and possibly even been in danger close situations where your lines are being overrun, and so you call in fire support to drop on the edge of your position, knowing full well chances are anywhere from decent to nearly certain that you'll kill some of your own. Jordan, knowing very well that this is something that sometimes happens in warfare, puts Rand in this position where he, a person alone, has to decide this tragic course of action, and in so doing, he writes a really striking scene. And one of the things I find most impactful is the fact that Rand grimaces, but doesn't hesitate, doesn't agonize, and while he's upset about it, he's not tortured because he knows that it's necessary, and it just is what it is. So then Samael attacks the tower and it collapses. Rand wakes from a brief moment of unconsciousness and feels that the wound in his side has broken open, but of course says nothing to anyone and just gathers the uninjured maidens and continues the fight from horseback. We switch to Matt, and then when we come back, it's dark and it says, Jaden stopped on a crest where a dozen trees made a thin topknot and ran hunched slightly against the pane in his side. The crescent moon, riding high, cast a pale light, yet even to his sight-amplified vision, anything more than 100 paces distant was featureless shadow. Night swallowed the surrounding hills whole, and he was only intermittently aware of Sulan hovering nearby, and maidens all around him. But then he could not seem to keep his eyes more than half open. They felt grainy, and he thought the gnawing pain in his side might be all that held him awake. He did not think of it often. Thought was not only distant now, it was slow. Was it twice Samael had attempted his life today, or 3 times? More? It seemed that he should be able to remember how often someone had tried to kill him. No, not to kill, to bait. Are you still so jealous of me, Teljanin? When did I ever slight you or give you one finger less than your due? Swaying, Rand scrubbed a hand through his hair. There had been something odd about that thought, but he could not recall what. Samael? No. He could deal with him when... if... no matter. Later. Today, Samael was only a distraction from what was important. He might even be gone. Vaguely it seemed that there had been no attack after... after what? He recalled countering Samael's last move with something particularly nasty, but he could not pull the memory to the surface. Not balefire. Mustn't use that. Threatens the fabric of the pattern. Not even for Elena. I would burn the world and use my soul for tinder to hear her laugh again. He was drifting again, away from what was important. However long ago the sun had gone down, it had sunk on fighting, lengthening shadows gradually overwhelming the golden red light, the men killing and dying. Now vagrant winds still brought distant shouts and screams, because of Couladin, true, but at the heart of it because of himself. For a moment he could not remember his name. Rand al'Thor, he said aloud, and shivered, though his coat was damp with sweat. For an instant that name had sounded strange to him. I am Rand al'Thor, and I need to see. So, Rand's exhausted, delirious, and slipping. RJ gives us this hazy stream of consciousness narrative that seems to flit seamlessly between Rand and Lews Therin, and shows that Rand is starting to lose track of himself. The maidens tell him that the wise ones need to speak to him and steer him into their camp, where he sees Moraine healing injured people and Asmodean giving them water, a chore he abandons to go to Rand the moment that he sees him. It says, I was sure you must be safe. I was sure. From his tone of voice, he had been no such thing. When Rand did not speak, Asmodean shrugged uncomfortably. Moraine insisted I carry water. A forceful woman to not allow the Lord Dragon's bard to... Trailing off, he licked his lips quickly. What happened? Samael, Rand said, but not in answer. He was just speaking the thoughts that drifted through the void. I remember when he was first named Destroyer of Hope, after he betrayed the gates of Heaven and carried the shadow down into the Rorn Medoy and the heart of Satel. Hope did seem to die that day. Kulan Kuhan wept. What is wrong? Asmodean's face had gone as white as Sulin's hair. He only shook his head mutely. Rand peered at the pavilion. Whoever was speaking now, he did not know her. Is that where they are waiting for me? Then I should join them. They will not welcome you yet, Lon said, appearing beside Asmodean, who jumped, or any man. Rand had not heard or seen the warder approach either, but he only turned his head. Even that seemed an effort. It seemed to be someone else's head. They meet with the wise ones from the Miagoma, the Kadara, the Shianda, and the Durine. The clans are coming to me, Rand said flatly, but they had waited long enough to make today bloodier. It never happened like that in the stories. So it seems. But the four chiefs will not meet you until the wise ones have made their arrangements, Lon added dryly. Come, Moraine can tell you more than I of it. Rand shook his head. Done is done. I can hear details later. If Han doesn't need to keep them from our backs any longer, then I need him. Sulin, send a runner. Han... It is done, Rand, the warder said insistently. All of it. Only a few Shido remain south of the city. Thousands have been taken prisoner, and most of the rest are crossing the Galen. Word would have been sent to you an hour ago had anyone known where you were. You've kept moving. Come and let Moraine tell you. Done? We've won? You have won, completely. Rand peered at the men being bandaged, the patient lines awaiting bandages and those leaving with them, the rows that lay almost unmoving. Moraine was still making her way alongside those, pausing wearily here and there to heal. Only a few of the wounded would be here, of course. They would have been coming as they could throughout the day, leaving as and when they could, if they could. None of the dead would be here. Only a battle lost is sadder than a battle won. He seemed to remember saying that before, long ago. Perhaps he had read it. No, there were too many living in his responsibility for him to worry over the dead. But how many faces will I know, like Julian's? I will never forget Ilyena, not if all the world burns. Frowning, he raised a hand to his head. Those thoughts had seemed to come on top of one another from different places. He was so tired he could hardly think. But he needed thoughts that did not slide by almost beyond his reach. He released the source in the void and convulsed as Sidene almost drove him under in that moment of retreat. He barely had time to realize his mistake. With the power gone, exhaustion and pain crashed down on him. He was aware of faces turned up to him as he toppled from the saddle, mouths moving, hands reaching to grab him, cushion his fall. "Moraine!" Lon shouted, his voice hollow in Rand's ears. "He is bleeding badly." Sulin had his head cradled in her arms. "Hold on, Randall Thor," she said urgently. "Hold on." Asmodean said nothing, but his face was bleak, and Rand felt a trickle of saidine flowing into him from the man. Darkness came. So he nearly kills himself. And I feel like Jordan has the taint affect him more when he's exhausted, because Rand seems different after all of this. He seems crazier. And he's certainly alarmed by the whole thing, as we see when we get to his point of view in the next chapter. It begins. Rand's eyes opened slowly, staring up at the roof of his tent. He was naked beneath a single blanket. The absence of pain seemed almost startling, yet he felt even weaker than he remembered. And he did remember. He had said things, thought things. His skin went cold. I cannot let him take control. I am me. Me. He gets updated regarding the battle and the aftermath by Avienda, and he's thinking of all of Samuel's bullshit and how he began implementing his response to it the previous day by putting Lord Melanril in charge of the Terran cavalry and sending Weirman back to Tyr to commence the military buildup on the border of Ilion. And then it says, I need to go into the city. Natail, have Jaden saddled and brought up. Tomorrow, perhaps, Avienda told him firmly, catching Asmodean's coat sleeve as he started to rise. Moraine Sedai said you would need to rest for today, Avienda. Now. I don't know why Mylon isn't here if he's alive, but I mean to find out. Natail, my horse? She put on a stubborn face, but Asmodean jerked his arm free, smoothing the wrinkled velvet, and said, Mylon was here, and others. He was not to be told, Avienda began angrily, then tightened her mouth before finishing. He needs to rest. So the wise ones thought they could keep things from him. Well, he was not as weak as they believed. He tried to stand, holding the blanket close, and turned the motion into shifting his position when his legs refused to cooperate. Maybe he was as weak as they thought, but he did not intend to let that stop him. I can rest when I'm dead, he said, and wished he had not when she flinched as if he had hit her. No, she would not have flinched at a blow. His staying alive was important to her for the Aiel's sake, and a threat there could hurt her more than a fist. Tell me about Mylon, Natail. Avienda kept a sullen silence, though if looks had had anything to do with it, Asmodean would have been struck dumb as well. A rider had come from Mylon in the night, bearing flowery praises and assurances of undying loyalty. At dawn, Mylon himself appeared with the 6 other High Lords of Tyr who were in the city, and a small host of Terran soldiers who fingered sword hilts and gripped lances as though more than half expecting to fight the Aiel who had stood silently watching them ride in. It came close, Asmodean said. This Mylon is not used to being thwarted, I think, and the others scarcely more so, especially the lumpy-faced one, Torian, and Saman. That one has eyes as sharp as his nose. You know I am used to dangerous company, but these men are as dangerous in their way as any I've known. And the Aiel told the Terrans that Rand was not available to take their call and to fuck off, which their body language seemed to indicate was not taken well. It says, Mylon's eyes were bulging out of his head, the man finished, but before leaving he shouted out his allegiance and fealty to you. The others echoed him quickly, yet Mylon added something that made them stare. I make a gift of Cairhien to the Lord Dragon, he said. Then he announced that he would prepare a grand triumph for you when you're ready to enter the city. There's an old saying in the 2 Rivers, Rand said dryly. The louder a man tells you he's honest, the harder you must hold on to your purse. Another said the fox often offers to give the duck its pond. Cairhien was his without gifts from Mylon. He had no doubts about the man's loyalty. It would last just as long as Mylon believed he would be destroyed if caught betraying Rand. If caught, that was the hook. Those 7 High Lords in Cairhien had been the most assiduous in trying to see him dead in Tyr. That was why he had sent them here. Had he executed every Terran noble who plotted against him, there might have been none left. At the time, handing them anarchy, famine, and civil war to deal with 1,000 miles from Tyr had seemed a good way to put a crimp in their schemes while doing some good where it needed doing. Of course, he had not even known Couladin existed then, much less that the man would lead him to Cairhien. And then Asmodean also tells him that a whole bunch of Kyrianen came, and we hear Lord Dobrain and Lady Colavir's names for the first time because both of them took Asmodean aside and said lots of Dias Daimari things. So RJ takes this chance to introduce us to the two of them. Rand wants to get the jump on my lawn, who announced that when the Lord Dragon's ready, he'll have a grand triumph to parade him through the city, and Rand's just not here for it. His taste in spectacles is quite different from Mylon's, as is his general taste in what it means to act like a decent human being, and he owes it to the Kyrianen to fix this inevitable shit show that came about from sending the Terrans into their country under this asshole's command. There aren't any Kyriadan banners flying, so Rand's subordinates, here under his orders, are treating this land like a conquered nation. And RJ uses Asmodean to let us know that Mylon's ambition is deadly, because when he tells Rand about the Kyriadan coming to the camp demanding to speak with the Lord Dragon, he mentions that they came cloaked and hooded and prepared to shake Asmodean as a Terran spy because they were terrified that Mylon would know that they were there. Mylon is as big a headache now as he was in the last book, and Rand needs to deal with him and not give him any time for any kind of surprises. Chapter 46 is called Other Battles, Other Weapons, and the first third of it surrounds drama with Avienda and her holding his clothes hostage. And when they finally get a move on, Rand gets his first glimpse of the Saswayamon, and the two of them have their discussion about the Aiel's different ways of dealing with the news that Rand revealed, something that I explored in episode 39. But eventually, Rand's escort rides through the ashes of the Foregate and into the city, where he is faced with the people. The people that he normally doesn't spend much time interacting with because he's dealing with nobles and bureaucrats and bullshit. It says, worn and ragged as they were, jammed together like sheep in a too small pen, they cheered. He had no idea how they knew who he was, unless perhaps the officers' shouts at the gates had been heard. But a roar sprang ahead of him as he circled through the streets, the maidens forcing a way through the throng. The thunder of it overwhelmed any words except for the occasional Lord Dragon when enough shouted it together. But the meaning was clear, and men and women holding up children to see him pass, and scarves and scraps of cloth waved from every window, and people who tried to push past the maidens with outstretched hands. They certainly seemed to have no fear of Aiel, not at the chance to lay a finger on Rand's boots, and their numbers were such, the pressure of hundreds shoving them forward, that some managed to wriggle through. Actually, a good many touched Asmodeans instead. He certainly looked a lord in all his dripping lace, and perhaps they thought the Lord Dragon must be an older man than the youth in a red coat. But it made no difference. Whoever managed to put a hand to anyone's boot or stirrup, even Peven's, wore a joy on their faces and mouthed Lord Dragon into the din, even as maidens forced them back with their bucklers. Between the clamor of acclaim and the riders sent by the officer at the gate, it was no surprise when Mylon appeared, a dozen lesser Terran lords for retinue and 50 defenders of the stone to clear his way, laying about them with the butts of their lances. Gray-haired, hard and lean in his fine silk coat with stripes and cuffs of green satin, the High Lord sat his saddle with the stiff-backed ease of one who had been put on a horse and taught to command it almost as soon as he could walk. He ignored the sweat on his face and equally the possibility that his escort might trample someone. Both were minor annoyances, and the sweat likely the greater. Adorian, the pink-cheeked lordling who had come to Ianrod, was among the others, not quite so plump as he had been, so his red-striped coat hung on him. The only other Rand recognized was a broad-shouldered fellow in shades of green. Riemann had liked to play at cards with Matt back in the Stone, as he recalled. The others were older men for the most part. None displayed any more consideration of the crowd as they plowed through than Mylon. There was not one Kyrianan in the lot. The maidens let Mylon ride through when Rand nodded, but closed behind him to exclude the rest, a fact the High Lord did not notice at first. When he did, his dark eyes smoldered angrily. He was often angry, Mylon was, since Rand had first come to the Stone of Tyr. The noise began to abate with the Terran arrival, fading to a dull murmur by the time Mylon made a rigid bow to Rand from his saddle. His gaze flickered to Avienda before he decided to ignore her, just as he was trying to ignore the maidens. "The light illumine you, my Lord Dragon," Be you well come to Cairien. I must apologize for the peasants, but I was unaware you meant to enter the city now. Had I known they would have been cleared, I meant to give you a grand entry befitting the dragon reborn." "I've had one," Rand said, and the other man blinked. "As you say, my lord dragon," he went on after a moment, his tone making it clear that he did not understand. "If you will accompany me to the royal palace, I have arranged a small greeting. Small, indeed, I fear, since I had no warning of you, yet by this even I will make sure—" "Whatever you have arranged now will do," Rand cut in, and received another bow and a thin, oily smile for reply. The fellow was all subservience now, and in an hour he would be talking as to someone too feeble-witted to understand facts held under his nose. But beneath it all lay a contempt and hatred that he believed Rand did not see, although they shone in his eyes. Contempt because Rand was not a lord, not truly as Mylon saw it, by birth, and hatred because Mylon had had the power of life and death before Rand came, with few his equal and none his superior. To believe that the prophecies of the dragon would be fulfilled some day was one thing; to have them fulfilled, and his own power diminished by them, was quite another. There was a moment of confusion before Rand made Sulin allow the other Terran lords to bring their horses in behind Asmodean and Peven's banner. Mylon would have had the defenders clear the way again, but Rand curtly ordered that they follow behind the maidens. The soldiers obeyed, faces unchanging beneath the rims of their helmets, though their white-plumed officer shook his head, and the High Lord put on a condescending smile. That smile faded when it became clear that the crowds opened up easily ahead of the maidens. That they did not have to club a path through he attributed to the Aiel reputation for savagery, and frowned when Rand made no reply. One thing Rand made note of: now that he had Terrence with him, the cheers did not rise again. So Rand, who has all along felt an obligation to Cairien, especially to the folks that were forced to live outside the walls, gets this glimpse of how prepared they are to love him as long as he does right by them, which he sets to immediately. He actively counters Mylon's bullshit, supremely unconcerned with how angry he's been since Rand came to Tyr. Poor Mylon had to start obeying a commoner, and then he gets sent into a civil war, which he complained about when Rand told them, "So this is what we're doing next." Mylon's like, "That's a terrible idea. Interfering with a civil war is a quagmire." And Rand stomped on him and was like, "You have a question, Mylon?" And so now Mylon is trying to run with what Rand gave him, and he strongly hopes to be king of Cairien. And while Rand got the jump on Mylon, missing his prepared entry in favor of actually getting a feel for the city, Mylon ran with that and was able to get the jump on his fellow High Lords, as we see when they reach the palace. It says, "The other High Lords greeted him at the foot of the broad gray stairs that led up from the courtyard, all in colorful silk coats and satin stripes and silver-worked boots. It was plain that none were aware Mylon had gone to meet him until after the fact. Potato-faced Torian, oddly languid for such a lumpy man, sniffed anxiously at his scented handkerchief. Gwaham, oiled beard making his head seem even balder, clenched fists the size of small hams, and glared at Mylon even as he bowed to Rand. Saman's sharp nose seemed to quiver in outrage. Maricon, with blue eyes rare in Tyr, compressed his thin lips until they almost disappeared, and while Heron's narrow face was all smiles, he tugged unconsciously at one earlobe as he did when furious. Only blade-slender Ericombe showed no outward emotion, but then he almost always kept his anger well banked until ready to let it burst into flame. It was too good an opportunity to miss. Silently thanking Moraine for her lessons. It was easier to trip a fool than to knock him down, she said. Rand clasped Torian's pudgy hand warmly and clapped Gwaham on the point of a thick shoulder, returned Heron's smile with one warm enough for a close companion, and nodded silently to Ericombe with a seemingly significant glance. Saman and Maricon he all but ignored after one look as flat and cool as a deep winter pond for each. That was all it needed for the moment, beyond watching their eyes shift and faces tighten in thought. They had played Dias Daimar, the game of houses, their entire lives, and being among Cairienin who could read volumes in a raised eyebrow or a cough had only heightened their sensitivity. Each man knew Rand had no reason to be friendly toward him, but each had to wonder if his own greeting was only to cover something real with someone else. Saman and Maricon appeared the most worried, yet the others eyed those two perhaps the most suspiciously of all. Perhaps his coolness had been the true cover, or maybe that was what they were meant to think. For himself, Rand thought that Moraine would be proud of him, and so would Tom Maryland, even if none of these seven was actively plotting against him at the moment, something he did not think even Matt would bet on. Men in their positions could do much to disrupt his plans without being seen to, and they would do so from habit if for no other reason, or they would have. He had them off balance now. If he could keep them that way, they would be too busy watching each other and too afraid of being watched in turn to trouble him. They might even obey for once without finding 100 reasons why things should be done differently from what he wanted. Well, that might be asking too much. So he orders them inside and is announced and cheered, and it says, between massive square columns of marble, thick streaked with blue so deep it was almost black, stood more Terrans than Rand expected. Ranks of lords and ladies of the land, dressed in their finest, in peaked velvet hats and coats with puffy striped sleeves, in colorful gowns and lace ruffs and close-fitting caps intricately embroidered or sewn with pearls or small gems. To their rear were the Cairhienin, darkly garbed except for slashes of color across the breast of gown or knee-length coat. The more stripes and house colors, the higher the rank of the wearer, but men and women with color from neck to waist or lower stood behind Terrans clearly of minor houses, with yellow embroidery instead of thread of gold, and wool instead of silk. No few of the Cairhienin men had shaved and powdered the front of their heads. All of the younger men had. The Terrans looked expectant if uneasy. The Cairhienin faces could have been chiseled from ice. There was no way to say who had cheered and who not, but Rand suspected most of those cries had come from the front rows. And then they lead him toward the throne, and Rand's like, this is for somebody else. Bring me a comfortable chair. And they do so, and then it says, with Moraine's help, he had worked out what he must do here. Some he had known was right even without her suggestions. It would have been good to have her there to whisper in his ear if needed, instead of Avienda waiting to signal Samara, but there was no point in waiting. Surely every Terran and Cairhienin noble in the city was in this chamber. Why did the Cairhienin hang back? He said loudly, and the crowd of nobles shifted, exchanging confused glances. Terrans came to help, but that is no reason for Cairhienin to hold themselves in the rear here. Let everyone sort themselves by rank. Everyone. It was difficult to say whether Terrans or Cairhienin were the most stunned, though Mylon looked ready to swallow his tongue, and the other six not far behind. Even slow-burning Ericombe went white in the face, with much shuffling of boots and twitching aside of skirts. With many icy stares on both sides, it was done, until the front rows were all men and women with stripes across their chests, and the second held only a few Terrans. Mylon and his fellows had been joined at the foot of the dais by twice their number of Cairhienin lords and ladies, most graying, and every one stripes from neck nearly to knees, though perhaps joined was not the right word. They stood in two groups with a full 3 paces between, and looked away from one another so hard that they might as well have shaken fists and shouted. Every eye was on Rand, and if the Terrans were in a fury, the Cairhienin were still ice, with only hints of a thaw in the considering way they studied him. I have noticed the banners flying above Cairhien, he went on, once the movement stilled. It is well that so many of the crescents of Tyr fly. Without Terran grain, Cairhien would have no living to hoist a banner, and without Terran swords, the people of this city who survive today, noble as well as common, would be learning to obey the Shido. Tyr has earned her honor. That puffed up the Terrans, of course, bringing fierce nods and fiercer smiles, though it certainly seemed to confuse the High Lords, coming on the heels of the other. For that matter, the Cairhienin below the dais were eyeing one another doubtfully. But I do not need so many banners for myself. Let one dragon banner remain on the highest tower of the city, so all who approach can see, but let the rest be taken down and replaced with the banners of Cairhien. This is Cairhien, and the rising sun must and will fly proudly. Cairhien has her own honor, which she shall keep. And that is taken pretty well, at least by the Cairhien, and he gets a lot of cheers from that. They proceed to swear oaths of fealty. They kneel and swear by the light and their hope of salvation and rebirth to serve faithfully and obey. And I really appreciate that RJ here has Rand insisting on loyalty, but also earning it. He deserves those oaths, but with them comes an obligation to push back at the Terrans. all of these minor Terra nobles are up here, and when he sees them, Rand gives Mylon a what the fuck look, and the High Lord tells him a great many of them wish to serve you, and Rand's thinking, no. All of these people wanted power, all of them wanted lands, and you felt free to make promises because you knew they would support you in your quest to become king, and that's bullshit. So he pushes back at that. He gives them a little. He's like, you've done worthy deeds. You deserve praise and acknowledgement, but nothing else is owed to you. Irian is interesting because it's the second nation under Rand's banner, where he occupies this place of unofficial Lord Protector, filling a power vacuum, providing food and order, and coming to the rescue to save them from the Shido. Rand wants to do everything he can to help this country that he actually can't fucking stand. I've just re-listened to The Great Hunt, which was perfect timing to remind me how much he can't stand this place, full of weird people with their stupid fucking game that they force you to play. But it's been a shit show of anarchy and misery for a year now, since the last time he was here, and he wants to help it because maybe like in Tyr, he can upset things and make life less comfortable for all those assholes who just swore fealty to him so that Kyrian can become a better place for the people in the streets who were cheering for him. So we go back to Nynaeve and Elaine for chapters 47 through 50 as they leave Samara and sail to Saladar and experience their inevitable disappointment. And then we return to Rand and Kyrian 10 days later. In all the previous chapter groupings, RJ explores his individual plot points and has them only lightly affect or interact with each other, usually in the world of dreams. This final section, chapter 51 through 56, is where it all finally intersects and we get our payout, starting with News Comes to Kyrian. This chapter begins with Rand taking a break from a meeting with the most powerful nobles, a break that's interrupted by Salanda, one of the many attendants Lady Coulevier has thrown at him in the hopes that she can get a spy into his bed. Rand terrorizes Salanda so she'll fuck off, which he does by playing up the crazy, and then feels like shit about himself for it. And then he slips into this almost stream of consciousness inner narrative that RJ uses to set the tone for the next bit of the scene. It says, even now, deep inside the palace, he could hear the murmur of a city jammed to bursting. Refugees from every corner of the land, more afraid to return to their homes than they were to have the dragon reborn in their midst. Merchants seeping in, selling whatever people could afford to buy and buying whatever people could not afford to keep. Lords and armed men rallying to his banner or to someone's, hunters for the horn thinking it must be found near him. A dozen foregaters or 100 were ready to sell it to any of them. Ogier stonemasons down from steading Sofu to see if there was work for their fabled skills. Adventurers, some of whom might have been bandits a week gone, come to see what they could pick up. There had even been 100 or so white cloaks, though they had galloped out as soon as it was clear the siege had been lifted. Did Pedro Niles' ingathering the White Cloaks concern him? Egwene gave him hints of things, but she saw matters from the White Tower wherever she stood. The Aes Sedai point of view was not his. At least the wagon trains full of grain were beginning to arrive from Tyr with some regularity. Hungry people could riot. He wished he could have simply left it at being glad that they were not so hungry any more, but there it was. The bandits were fewer, and the Civil War had not resumed. Yet, more good news, he had to make certain it stayed that way before he could leave. 100 things to take care of before he could go after Samael. Only Rourke and Bael remained of the chiefs he really trusted, those who had marched from Roydian with him. But if the 4 clans who had joined him late could not be trusted on the march to Tyr, could he trust them loose in Cairhien? Indirian and the others had acknowledged him as Kara Karn, but they knew him as little as he knew them. The message that morning might be a problem. Barrelane, first of Mayenne, was only a few 100 miles south of the city, on her way to join him with a small army. He had no idea how she had led it across Tyr. Oddly, her letter had asked if Perrin was with him. No doubt she feared Rand might forget her small country if she did not remind him. It might almost be a pleasure to watch her spar with the Kyrianan, the latest in a long line of firsts who had managed to keep Tyr from swallowing their country by playing the game of houses. Perhaps if he put her in charge here, he would be taking Mylon and the other Terrans with him when the time came, if it ever came. This was no better than what was waiting inside. Tapping the dottle from his pipe, he ground out the tobacco's last sparks under his boot. No need to risk fire to the garden. It would go up like a torch. The drought, the unnatural weather. He realized he was snarling silently. First work on what he knew he could do something about. It took an effort to smooth his face before he went in. And this is the first time that we're getting this kind of swirling problem narrative from Rand to such a large degree. Now that he's back in the wetlands and dealing with wetlander politics, he has a million things to juggle that just weren't there in the Waste, where life is simpler. We also see that Rand is starting to feel angry at the things that he has no control over. Angry enough that it's apparent on his face. He's silently snarling about the weather. And Jordan is setting up some things for Book 6, like the build-up in Ilion and Barrelane becoming Rand's regent in Cairhien, situations that will be well established and feel tonally like a matter of course when Lord of Chaos starts because there's roughly a month between the books. So Rand goes back into the meeting, and there's political bullshittery that I'm not going to delve too deeply into here because there are future episodes that would provide more interesting avenues to explore that from. So I'm going to skip to Rand telling the nobles to fuck off and Moiraine, Egwene, and Aviendha coming in. Moiraine has letters for Rand that have arrived from Tarvalon. One is from Elida and one is from Alviarin. And after the letters have been read and discussed, we get a rap came at the door as Samara put her flaxen head into the room. Matrim Cawthon has come, Karakarn. He says that you sent for him. 4 hours ago, as soon as he had learned Matt was back in the city. What would the excuse be this time? It was time to be done with excuses. Stay, he told the women. Wise ones made Matt almost as uneasy as Aes Sedai did. These three would put him off balance. He did not give a second thought to using them. He was going to use Matt, too. Send him in, Samara. Rand, who has sussed out what gifts Matt got from the foxes, has come to the point of bullying him and pushing him into accepting his duty. He's sick of Matt being the only one not stepping up, of trying to act like this can be fought, of being so selfish, and so is everyone else. So Moiraine takes point and pokes at Matt, and Egwene and Aviendha share space with him as women who can channel to make him nervous, and Rand watches as they get him upset, because the more upset Matt is, the easier it will be to push him. And Matt blows up, and it's like, all you fucking need is not even Elaine here being assholes, too. Well, I'm glad Elaine is not here for the shitty news about Morghese. She's dead. And Rand is murderously angry upon hearing this news. Angry with Robin, angry with himself, and he decides that Robin must die. Now, this minute, he will go and perform a raid, and Moiraine is like, okay, but do it tomorrow, and take Egwene and Aviendha and Smaigil with you. And once Rand sees the sense in that and agrees that tomorrow is soon enough, the women leave. And it says, he stared at the door long after it closed behind them. It was a scuff of boots that recalled him to Matt's presence. Matt was trying to slide toward the door, moving slowly so as not to be seen. I need to talk to you, Matt. Matt grimaced, touching the fox head like a talisman. He spun to face Rand. If you think I'm going to put my head on the block just because those fool women did, you can forget it now. I'm no bloody hero, and I don't want to be one. Morghese was a pretty woman. I even liked her as much as you can like a queen, but Robin is Robin, burn you, and shut up and listen. You have to stop running. Burn me if I will. This is no game I chose, and I said shut up. Rand drove the fox head against Matt's chest with a hard finger. I know where you got this. I was there, remember? I cut the rope you were hanging from. I don't know exactly what got shoved into your head, but whatever it is, I need it. The clan chiefs know war, but somehow you know it too, and maybe better. I need that. So this is what you're going to do. You and the band of the Red Hand. And we learn in Matt's point of view, which is the last perspective in this chapter, that it takes hours for Rand to bully him into agreeing to take over the army in Ilion. As Rand watches Moraine circling in on Matt, softening him for what he needs him to do, he wonders, is there anything left to me but necessity? So the guy who had the energy to whittle and do crafts and take some time for himself in book 4 is definitely gone, and Rand's beginning to hate the person that he always has to be. And it's tragic. The next chapter is called Choices, where Moraine tells Rand, hey, before y'all head off to Camelin, you should come down to the dock with me. There's some cool shit I gotta show you. So Rand chooses to go, and it just so happens that Lanfear has chosen that moment to pay Haddon and Kadir a site visit and request a sit rep. And Kadir chooses to tell Lanfear that Rand has been boning Avienda, and so she chooses to tear off his skin in her anger, which, rude, and blows up the wagon and engulfs people in flame and generally throws a tantrum. What a shit show. She attacks and hurts Egwene and Avienda, and Rand, who has all along struggled with how do you cut flows you can't see? It's something he's wondered about since Lanfear did it to him in the Stone of Tyr, and when he decided to go all hard with Asmodean about upping his teaching game, it was the skill he wanted to learn when he told him, you have 2 hours, try very hard. Rand finally has a sudden thought in the emptiness telling him, spirit woven so with fire and earth, there. And he cuts the flows Lanfear is using on Egwene and Avi, at which point she turns to him and screams that he's hers. And it says, no. Rand's voice seemed to come to his ears down a mile-long tunnel. Distract her from the girls. He kept moving forward, did not look back. I was never yours, Mirren. I will always belong to Elgina. The void quivered with sorrow and loss, and with desperation as he fought something besides the scouring of Sidene. For a moment he hung balanced. I am Rand al'Thor, and Elgina, ever and always my heart, balanced on a razor edge. I am Rand al'Thor. Other thoughts tried to well up, a fountain of them, of Elgina, of Mirren, of what he could do to defeat her. He forced them down, even the last. If he came down on the wrong side, I am Rand al'Thor. Your name is Lanfear, and I'll die before I love one of the Forsaken. Something that might have been anguish crossed her face. Then it was a marble mask once more. If you were not mine, she said coldly, then you were dead. And then she tortures him a hole punch before trying to sever him, and he has to keep cutting her flows. And it says, her attempted shield vanished, reappeared, returned as fast as he could cut it, but always with that momentary ebbing of Sidene, moments when it almost failed, leaving his counterstroke barely enough to foil her attack. Handling 2 weaves at once should have been easy. He could handle 10 or more, but not when one was a desperate defense against something he could not know was there until it was almost too late. Not when another man's thoughts kept trying to surface inside the void, trying to tell him how to defeat her. If he listened, it might be Lews Therin Telamon who walked away, with Rand al'Thor, a voice sometimes floating in his head. So this is a new stage of crazy for Rand. The consistent presence that Lews Therin has been, checking in during every point of view with intrusive thoughts and memories, is gaining agency, and Rand is now struggling for himself, and it's affecting his capacity to function. But if Rand would have let Lews Therin Telamon take the wheel, we'd get a better outcome, because chances are the original dragon doesn't have a tiresome penchant for infantilizing extremely dangerous people if they just so happen to have a vagina. Instead, Moraine has to come to the rescue, saving Rand from having his soul ripped out by tackling Lanfear through the doorway, which devastated the shit out of me every time I read it for years until RJ ruined it by making it clear she was still alive and robbing me of my pain. Boo, hiss. Lon tells Rand she's gone and that he can't feel her and gathers up his shit and leaves, and Rand looks around at the aftermath of this morning's colossal shit show, and it says, they were still watching him, the Aiel, the people atop the walls. The tower would know of today, or a version of it, as soon as a pigeon could fly there. If Ravin did have some way of watching as well, all it took was one raven in the city, one rat here along the river. He certainly would not expect anything today. Elida would think him weakened, perhaps more pliable, and Ravin, he realized what he was doing and winced. Stop it! For 1 minute at least, stop and mourn. He did not want all those eyes on him. Aiel fell back before him almost as readily as they had before Mandar. The dockmaster's slate-roofed hut was a single, windowless stone room lined with shelves full of ledgers and scrolls and papers, lit by 2 lamps on a rough table covered with tax seals and customs stamps. Rand slammed the door behind him to shut out eyes. Moraine dead, Egwene injured, and Lon gone, a high price to pay for Lanfear. "Mourn burn you," he growled. "She deserved that much. Don't you have any feelings left?" But mostly he felt numb. His body hurt, but under it was deadness. Book 5 is a small window where we see Rand with the kind of confidence a person in his position can only have once they've grown comfortable with their power and before they've fucked up in a way that they can't forgive themselves for. Rand will constantly punish himself for what happened to Moraine. There's so much regret. And there's a chance for Rand to grow from this, to reason out what he could have done differently, or to kick himself for not killing Lanfear, and resolve to learn the lesson and not let whether or not his opponent has tits affect his capacity to use deadly force. But instead of learning, RJ wrote a character who loves to make himself suffer. And to compound his suffering, Jordan has Sulin come into the dockmaster's hut as Rand is crying over Moraine's letter, telling him that she knew exactly how this was going to play out and did what she did because she knew he would drop the ball. The maidens were missing from Rand's door this morning because they had to have an emergency meeting where some drastic resolutions were proposed and agreed upon, and Sulin is there to tell him that she and her spear sisters have expectations that must be met in order to carry his honor, and if he can't hold up his end of the bargain, then they're going to go on permanent strike so they can look for honor in the next life. She begins snapping her spears, hoping to get his fucking attention, and Rand tries to explain to her his issue, that he finds women dying to be extremely distressing. And she lets him know that, despite what he wants to believe, his feelings don't matter more than everyone else's. Listen, Rand al'Thor, I am the spear. When a lover came between me and the spear, I chose the spear. Some choose the other way. Some decide they have run with the spears long enough, that they want a husband, a child. I have never wanted anything else. No chief would hesitate to send me wherever the dance is hottest. If I died there, my first sisters would mourn me, but not a fingernail more than when our first brother fell. A tree killer who stabbed me to the heart in my sleep would do me more honor than you do. Do you understand now? I understand, but he did understand. She did not want him to make her something other than what she was. All he had to do was be willing to watch her die. What happens if you break the last spear? If I have no honor in this life, perhaps in another. She said it as if it was just another explanation. It took him a moment to comprehend. All he had to do was be willing to watch her die. You don't leave me any choices, do you? No more than Moraine had. And Rand feels blackmailed, which I suppose is technically true, since he's been going to unreasonable lengths to prevent the deaths of women, and here he's being told women are going to die no matter what. But his saying that means Sulin has given him no choice isn't true. His choice is how they'll die. Will some of them die in battle carrying his honor, or will all of them die because he's taken their honor away, so they're left with, fuck Rand al'Thor, there's no honor here, time to wake from the dream and try again. Rand whines that he has no choices because none of his choices lead to where he wants. He has no path to take that allows him to save women at any and all cost to himself and everyone else who is fucked if he gets killed because he'd rather die than harm a betitted enemy. What he gets to choose is whether he will grow the fuck up and take responsibility for his emotions, quit being childish and selfish, or will the maidens have to do a drastic end run around his big feelings to show him your bullshit is not our problem? So he agrees to take as many maidens as any other society and privately decides to punish himself for giving into it. And it's very unhealthy, but that's the point. This has to be the most emotionally horrible day ever, and Rand's like, let's make it worse. That sounds like mental illness. And I wish RJ didn't lock Rand into the cop out of, I couldn't have done any of this differently, especially when he ends the chapter with this little bit after he and Sulan step outside and find everyone waiting. It says, the white smoke still rose as though flames yet consumed the ter'angreal. Moraine. He should have done was done. The maidens were crowding down around Sulan, as many as would fit onto the quay. Done was done, and he had to live with it. Death would be a release from what he had to live with. Should haves are meaningless when Rand looks at his fuck ups and thinks to himself that he couldn't have done it any other way because he just can't kill women. What's the point, except to make us frustrated and annoyed with Rand? I mean, I suppose there are some people that just feel bad for him, but I have a deficit of empathy for people who don't learn lessons and incorporate the should haves for next time. But maybe the point is just to have Rand, who has always been a melancholy sort, wallow in self punishment. And if that's the case, then let the games begin. Bael and a fuck pile of Aiel are waiting in the courtyard to go to Camelin, and when Rand reminds Bael that he doesn't know how many he can bring via skimming, it says, every spear that can follow you will. Will the two Aes Sedai come soon? No. It was good that Aviendha kept her promise not to let him touch her again. Lanfear had tried to kill her and Egwene because she did not know which was Aviendha. How Kadir found out to tell her. No matter. Lon was right. Women found pain or death when they came too close to him. They will not be coming. There are stories of trouble by the river. A great victory, Baal, Rand said wearily, and much honor earned. But not by me. As someone with mental health issues who spent a good portion of my young life wallowing in self punishment before I got over it, I feel that bit in my soul. And RJ decides to hit Rand where it hurts right away in this horrifying moment on their trip to Camelin as they're skimming. They're moving through this endless black where they're motionless. It's been about half an hour and it says, a slight stir ran through the Aiel. What is it? Rand asked. Murmurs came across the platform. Someone fell, a bulky man near him said at last. Rand recognized him. Mekiar. He was Corderai, a night spear. He wore the red headband. Not one of the... Rand began, then caught Sulan looking at him flat-eyed. He turned to stare out into the darkness, anger a stain clinging to the emotionless void. So it was not supposed to matter more to him if one of the maidens had fallen, was it? It did, falling forever through endless black. Would sanity crack before death came from starvation or thirst or fear? In that fall, even an Aiel must eventually find fear strong enough to stop a heart. He almost hoped so. It must be more merciful than the other. Burn me. What happened to all that hardness I was so proud of? A maiden or a stone dog, a spear is a spear. Only thinking it could not make it so. I will be hard. He would let the maidens dance the spears where they wished. He would, and he knew he would search out the name of every one who died, that every name would be another knife cut on his soul. I will be hard. The light help me, I will. The light help me. I love how Jordan has Rand imagine what it would be like to fall off the platform. It makes it infinitely more awful. And because for Rand, it would be even more infinitely more awful to know it was a woman falling. He seeks reassurance, like, please let it not be one of the maidens. And he gets called out with a death glare by Sulan. Like, you literally agreed 10 minutes ago that your bullshit was your problem and no one else is responsible for how you feel. And Rand's furious about it because he's young and still immature in a lot of ways, and learning to take responsibility for your own emotions is not something you can do in 10 minutes when you have the most stressful job in the world and you're going insane. A lot of people live long lives and die, never managing it. But Rand shuts his fucking mouth. He keeps it to himself and commits to this promise to make himself suffer for this agreement he made, which is childish in its own right. He agreed not to inflict his pathological need to infantilize the maidens on them, but he's going to turn it inward instead and torture himself because they told him to fuck off with his ludicrous feelings and no matter what, we die. And people feel however they feel about things, and sometimes it's hard to remember that this business with the maidens happened immediately after the fuck up that Rand feels the worst about, his greatest failure, which is the death of Moraine. And I wish RJ had made him learn instead of leaning into the lazy black and white device of once Rand is okay killing women, we know he's too far gone. Rand is such a nuanced character for the most part, and there's such a lack of nuance to that it's frustrating. Anyway, they arrive on the slope that abuts the wall of the palace garden in Camelin, and shock of shocks, fuckery abounds. Trollocs burst out, and lightning strikes, and Mat, Avienda, and Asmodean are killed, and Ryan screams, Raven! And lost in rage and grief, he does the gateway for traveling for the second time, and we get a much better description than we did in The Eye of the World, when all we get is, and Rand was no longer on the hilltop. And he steps through to the throne room, laying waste. And we switch to Nynaeve's point of view, where she's having her lesson with Swan, and Moghedien pops up. Nynaeve captures her, and Moghedien is like, hey, I've got good intel. Rand al'Thor was going to attack Ravin, but Ravin's been expecting some kind of fuckery this whole time because he wasn't stupid enough to actually trust Lanfear, so your buddy could be walking into a major shit show. And Nynaeve decides, I'm going to take this asshole and go to Camelin and see what I see, which ends the chapter. The penultimate chapter of The Fires of Heaven, chapter 55, is called The Threads Burn. Rand is still looking for Ravin through the palace, which is mostly deserted. Ravin wasn't fucking around once he got the intel about Rand's intended raid, considering he managed to bring all of the Shadow Spawn in. I'm not exactly sure where he was hiding them in the meantime. Maybe in the basement of the building with the Waygate? Anyway, RJ uses this final bit to show how much more muddied the divide is between Rand and Lews Therin Telamon, and also just how miserable Rand is. It says, the corridor was doubly familiar, once for having seen it before, once for having seen something similar. I walked this way with Elaine and Gowan the day I met Morghese. The thought slithered painfully along the boundaries of the void. He was cold in there, without emotion. Saidin raged and burned, but he was icy calm. And another thought like a stab. She lay on the floor like this, her golden hair spread as though sleeping. Elyena's sun hair, my Elyena. Elida had been there that day, too. She foretold the pain I'd bring. She knew the darkness in me. Some of it. Enough. Elyena, I did not know what I was doing. I was mad. I am mad. Oh, Elyena. Elida knew. Some. But she did not tell even all of that. Better if she had told. Oh, Light, is there no forgiveness? I did what I did in madness. Is there no mercy? Gareth Bryn would have killed me had he known. Morghese would have ordered my death. Morghese would be alive, perhaps. Elaine's mother alive. Avienda alive. Mat. Moraine. How many alive if I had died? I have earned my torment. I deserve the final death. Oh, Elyena, I deserve death. I deserve death. He hears boots behind him, and it's a bunch of Gabriel's white lions being led by a Myrddraal, and it says, Rand. He thought that was his name, channeled in a way he could not remember doing before. Men and Myrddraal stiffened where they stood. White frost grew thick on them, frost that smoked as Mat's boots had smoked. The Myrddraal's upraised arm broke off with a loud crack. When it hit the floor tiles, arm and sword shattered. Rand could feel the cold. Yes, that was his name, Rand. Cold like a knife as he walked past and turned the way they had come. Cold, yet warmer than Saidin. RJ does wonders here with the many layers of Rand's relationship with Lews Therin, overlapping their similarities with their desire for punishment and wanting this whole ordeal to end, while contrasting how much crazier Lews Therin sounds and how Rand struggles with not wanting to lose himself. A short time later, Raven shoots balefire at Rand, and Rand returns the favor and then runs after Raven into a sitting room and comes across a gateway residue that leads him into the world of dreams. He follows Raven into Tel Riyadh, and it says, wherever this was, it was a strange place. It came to him as he trotted along another colonnade, sensing for Raven that he had not heard the voice crying over Ilyena since he channeled balefire. Perhaps he had somehow chased Lews Therin out of his head. Good. He stopped at the edge of one of the palace gardens. The roses and white star bushes looked as drought bedraggled as they would have in the real palace. On some of the white spires rising above the rooftops, the white lion banner rippled, but which spire could change in the blink of an eye? Good, if I don't have to share my head with. He felt odd, insubstantial. He raised his arm and stared. He could see the garden through coat sleeve and arm as through a mist that was thinning. When he glanced down, he could see the walk's paving stones through himself. No! It was not his thought. An image began to coalesce. A tall, dark-eyed man with a worry-creased face and more white in his hair than brown. I am Rand al'Thor, Rand broke in. He did not know what was happening, but the faint dragon was beginning to fade from the misty arm held in front of his face. The arm began to look darker, the fingers on his hand longer. I am me. That echoed in the void. I am Rand al'Thor. He fought to picture himself in his own mind, struggled to make the image of what he saw in the mirror every day shaving, what he saw in a stand mirror dressing. It was a frantic fight. He had never really looked at himself. The two images waxed and waned, the older dark-eyed man and the younger with blue-gray eyes. Slowly the younger image firmed, the older faded. Slowly his arm grew more solid, his arm with the dragon twined around it and the heron branded into his palm. There had been times he hated those marks, but now, even enclosed within the emotionless void, he almost grinned to see them. Why had Lews Therin tried to take him over, to make him into Lews Therin? He was sure that was who that dark-eyed man with the suffering face had been. Why now? Because he could in this place, whatever it was? Wait, it had been Lews Therin who shouted that adamant no. Not an attack by Lews Therin, by Raven, and not using the power. If the man had been able to do this back in Camelin, the real Camelin, he would have. It had to be some ability he had gained here, and if Raven had gained it, perhaps he had too. The image of himself had been what held him, brought him back. He focused on the nearest rosebush, a thing a span high, and imagined it growing thin, foggy. Obediently it melted away to nothing, but as soon as the picture in his mind was nothing, the rosebush was suddenly back, just as it had been. Rand nodded coldly. It had limits, then. There were always limits and rules, and he did not know them here. But he knew the power, as much as Asmodean had taught him and he had taught himself, and Sidene was still in him, all the sweetness of life, all the corruption of death. Raven had to have seen him to attack. With the power, you had to see something to affect it or know exactly where it was in relation to you, down to a hair. Perhaps it was different here, but he did not think so. He almost wished Lews Therin had not gone silent again. The man might know this place and its rules. So I love this bit here because it shows how smart Rand is and how good his deduction and his reasoning are. Here, RJ lays the first brick in the foundation of cooperation with Lews Therin, having Rand wish that he would speak up because his knowledge is so often useful. And I said before, when I was analyzing the end of The Dragon Reborn, that I appreciate this second climactic scene in the Fires of Heaven because RJ took the opportunity to do another boss battle in Tel Riyadh. Only now he's got the rules ironed out, and he has in Nynaeve the perspective of someone who actually understands much of how the world of dreams functions, and so she can articulate it in her narrative. Rand's Balefire reset, where he uses all the power he can draw to burn Raven out of existence, and in so doing reverses the lightning that killed Aviendha and Mat and Asmodean. It seems to pull him back a smidge from the brink that he's poised on. After he balefires Raven, Rand talks a bit with Nynaeve. She heals him and tells him, hey, the wise ones say that being here in the flesh is dangerous. You should go back. So he returns to the waking world and sees that Mat and Aviendha are alive. And it brings him a real moment of happiness to the point of actually trying to gasp, hug another dude because he's so overjoyed. And Matt, who doesn't know that he died, does not feel the situation is emotionally catastrophic enough to call for dudes hugging and tries to fend him off and like, what the hell, dude? And then we get he took in the plaza again and his joy faded. Nothing could extinguish it, but the bodies lying in heaps where the Aiel had made their stand lessened it. Too many of them were not big enough to be men. There was Lamel, veil gone, and half her throat as well. She would never make him soup again. Pevin, both hands clutching the wrist-thick shaft of the Trolloc spear through his chest, and the first expression on his face Rand had ever seen. Surprise. Balefire had cheated death for his friends, but not for others. Too many maidens. Take what you can have. Rejoice in what you can save, and do not mourn your losses too long. It was not his thought, but he took it. It seemed a good way to avoid going mad before the taint on Sidene drove him to it. And while it says that he takes the thought, he doesn't. The Randall Thor from now until the last that could be done rejoices in nothing and punishes himself for what can't be saved. He never stops mourning his losses, and he emotionally scourges himself to make them worse. Because for Rand, a person who will casually manipulate and use his friends because he has nothing left but necessity. A person who left his girlfriend's mother to die in the hands of a Forsaken because he couldn't afford to walk into a trap. A person like that deserves only sorrow and punishment and pain. Poor Rand. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Podcast of the Dragon. My last episode about Nynaeve was so grueling that when I got home from JordanCon, I spent a month doing jigsaw puzzles before I could even think of going back to podcasting. I swore I would never do an episode that long again, but this one almost came close. My rough drafts are available on Patreon. Depending on life circumstances and how many spoons I have, they could be uploaded 2 to 6 weeks before the final, and you'll be able to see how it improved, what I added, and what I cut out. If you'd like to support the show and have access to that or other fun content, there's a link in the show notes. There are other links to my Discord, to my email, to the Watt Trivia and Games Discord, and to the Watt Fandom and Calendar Discord, as well as to my YouTube, where I'll be making videos about the Wheel of Time Season 2 as soon as it comes out, and to my Twitter handle, @PodOfTheDragon. There's also a link to Apple Podcasts. If you could go and review me either there or on whatever platform you're listening on, I'd really appreciate it because it will help other people find me, and so will word of mouth. So if you know anyone who likes the Wheel of Time and might be interested in a different kind of podcast, please tell them about me. My music is by Kevin MacLeod. My name is Morgan. And at this point, I'm pretty good at taking responsibility for my own emotions, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that there are times that feel strikingly similar to RJ's descriptions of wrestling with Sidene.